the Mendocino County Employees Retirement Association May 17, 2023 meeting, and we'll start with a roll call.
Trustee Cubison?
Here.
Trustee Cavanis?
Here.
Trustee Jurdy?
Here.
Trustee Smith is absent by prior arrangement. Trustee Cromer?
Here.
Trustee Shoemaker?
Here.
Trustee Harris? Trustee Anderson?
Here.
Thank you.
Thank you. If we could all stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. Ready? Begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. So we have the opportunity for public comment at this time for matters both on and off the agenda. Do we have any members of the public that would like to make comment at this time?
There is no public comment.
Thank you. That takes us to item number 1, our consent agenda. All matters on the consent agenda are to be approved by unanimous consent unless a member of our board would like to pull an item for separate discussion. Is there any such ambition? Seeing none, all matters on the consent agenda will be approved by unanimous consent. Item number 2 is discussion and possible action regarding the Triennial Actuarial Experience Study. It's a tongue twister. We have representatives from Siegel here, Mr. Paul Angelo and Andy Young. Take it away.
Okay, good. We're working here. Good morning, members of the board. I'm Paul Angelo with Siegel. I'm joined with Andy Young. And this is your Triennial, every 3 years, experience study. As you're aware, you see Andy every year when he presents the annual valuation, which usually comes in the fall. And that's where we take the assumptions and the data and the investment returns and the financial information. But we always like to point out, by the time you get to the valuation, it could almost be a consent item because all the decisions have been made and it's basically a big number crunch. But this is where the decisions are made that ultimately will determine those costs in this valuation and the 2 following. And so what we do is we go through every single actuarial assumption. There are economic assumptions and demographic assumptions, and we review each one. For the demographic assumptions, we generally compare what has happened in either just the last 3 years, or sometimes we'll go back and pick up multiple study years, the last 3 years, 6 years, 9 years, and compare that to with the assumption, the current assumption, and then through a sort of a blending technique called credibility, come up with a recommended demographic assumption. The economic assumptions are different. They are much more forward-looking. Some of them are more macroeconomic, and that includes the most famous actuarial assumption of always is the expected rate of return. That's the one that gets more discussion than all the others combined. So what we're going to do today, we will be working from our report, and Judy's going to help us drive through this. We're actually going to start with the demographic assumption section, and we'll save the economic assumptions for last. The demographic assumptions, again, usually do not get nearly as much discussion as the economics. So, Judy, if we can jump in our report to, let salary increase, get past that one. I have little tabs, but I didn't have a tab for this page. Yes, to page 30, 30. There it is. So we're going to start with, we're not going to go through each of the demographic assumptions, but it's a very familiar pattern. We will show you, I tend to look more at the graphs than at the tables. So Judy, if you can go 1 page forward. This is retirement rates. This is what are the probabilities that a member will retire. Now, we did introduce a new feature in this year's experience study. And we used to only base the probability of retirement on age. What we have found, and this was actually brought to our attention in actuarial audits, when another audit firm comes in and looks at our stuff, we have found that the people with longer service tend to retire at a different rate because they can afford to. And so we are now, for both general members and for safety members, we're breaking the experience into people with under a certain threshold of service. For general, we use 30 years. and then for people with over that. And then for safety, did the same thing, but we found the age to use that fit the data best was 25. Now, again, this is the table that shows the current assumption, actual rate for the last 6 years, actual rate for the last 3 years. Again, because we've been in an unusual period demographically because of COVID, we grab a little more data. And then, then Andy and his team, they have that current rate, they have the actual rates, and then you come up with proposed rate. I think this is so much easier to see on a graph, so I'm going to ask Judy if we can now go to page 41. And on page 41, you'll see a lot of this kind of graph in these reports, and the colors are always the same. The red diamond is the current assumption. The green, whether it's green squares, which in this case is just is the last 6 years, or the light green circle, which is the last 3 years, that's the actual rates. And like all actual data, you look down at the bottom one for retirement rates with members with more than 30 years of service, there just aren't that many of those people. So you'll see it jumps up and down because at some ages, age 59, there were no retirements. But that doesn't mean we're going to set our assumption that way. So then Andy and his team, their task is to take the two green lines, the green circles and the green squares, and compare that to the red triangles, and then come up with a new recommended assumption, which is the blue. And you can see in general terms there. Andy, why don't you comment on just what the general direction was as how these move?
Yeah, in general, we like to kind of split the difference a little bit between what we actually observe as the actual rates of retirement versus what the assumptions is, because after all, we came up with the current assumptions by looking at the experience for our membership, the Mendocino County Employee Retirement Association membership, for many, many years. So we don't want to just disregard that experience by looking only at 6 years worth of data.
Right. So again, that's our methodology here. You'll see we're not going to go through, there are graphs like this for termination rates, for rates of disability. The only one, the assumption that behaves a little differently is mortality. And that's because you are not a large enough system to generate enough data to build a mortality table. So what we do instead is we use standard mortality tables. And starting with the previous assumption, the one in 2020, we had a new mortality table that was put up by the Society of Actuaries based exclusively on public sector experience. We never had that before. It's called Pub 2010. And there are separate rates for teachers, for general members, and for safety, and also for contingent survivors, for survivors. And so we now use those as the standard tables. And then, for a large plan where you have, the rule of thumb is if you have 1,000 deaths in the study period, you can believe the local data. So then you take the standard table and you sort of just scale it up or down to match that system's experience. You do not have that volume of data, so we pretty much use the standard table.
For clarification, you said it was publication 210. Is that just the number, or is that the year that
it was? The year. It's pub as in public.
So it was published in 2010, and hasn't the just national trends, not relating to public service, but all members of society, they're getting older since 2010. So wouldn't that be out of date already?
Well, it's not that they're getting older, it's the other way, because the table takes advances in age into account. There's a probability of death at each age. So as a person gets older, the table anticipates.
No, but I'm saying nationally, in 2022, aren't people on average living longer than they were in 2010?
Yes, and for that, in addition to adopting a base table, we adopt what is called a mortality improvement scale. And so what we do is we take that Pub 2010 and using these mortality improvement scales, advance it to the current year. So that is absolutely anticipated. So even though it's still, the base table is called Pub 2010, Pub 2010, it is Pub 2010, and let's find a place where we describe that aspect of it.
And maybe page 47 of
If we
the
go to
report.
page 47. Oops. I put this tab in the wrong place. So what you'll see stated on page 47 there is, so for general members, we recommend maintaining the post-retirement mortality to follow the Pub 2010, but then projected generationally using what is called MP, Mortality Projection Scale 2021. So we actually assume that this is something that you adopted, I think, 2 studies ago, what's called generational mortality. And what it does, Mr. Deere, is to anticipate, is to build in those mortality improvements. So the joke is, it used to be, if you meet an actuary in a bar, you could say, what's the probability of me dying this year? They only had to ask you how old you are. Now they have to ask you not only how old you are, but what year is it? Because the probability of a 60-year-old dying in 2023 is, go the other way. The probability of a 60-year-old, someone who's 60 in the year 2030, has a lower probability of death than a person who is 60 in 2023. So that is actually built in. So we not only do that from today forward, we also do that, we take the Pub 2010 table and advance it using these projection scales from 2010 to 2023. That's our base table, and then we also build in future mortality improvements going forward.
So as a
you're right on
practical matter, if in 2010, the general public would have, a 60-year-old would have likely died at, let's just say, 82.
Right.
And now in 2022, the general public might have died at 84, 2 years later. Would you simply add 2 years to the 2010 public employee number? You said you're using the baseline as the public 210 publication based in 2010, but if the general public is living, just say, 2 years longer than they were back in 2010, would you just add 2 years? Because you're saying, I'm assuming there's not an updated version of this government employee table.
Right, right. It is not as, we actually do not use life expectancies. What we have is actual probabilities of death at each age. And so, Andy, let's pick do we have the entire tables in here? Probably not. If there's a 0.4%, what we actually take the probabilities of death and reduce those probabilities by 1% each year. So if in 1 year a probability of death at a certain age is 0.4, the next year it's going to be 0.4 reduced by 1%, so 0.396. So it's not a matter of saying life expectancy changes. We actually do it for each probability at each age. Those probabilities are reduced using these projection scales.
I'm just trying to understand, how is it being updated?
Being updated by taking whatever the probabilities are in the table and making them a little bit smaller each year. So you take whatever the probability of death was in a particular year, and at that age, next year, it'll be that number times 0.99. And the next year, it'll be that number times 0.99. So the probability of death gets smaller by about 1% each year.
Right. So then what we do is run through the computer program. The program will realize that, oh, now there's a slight increase in the life expectancy, which will indirectly translate into a higher cost to provide for the longer lifetime benefit to be paid for that retiree. So the practical impact, even though Paul, of course, is right in this case, the computer program does not use life expectancy as an input, but because those probabilities of death are getting smaller, as a result, more benefits need to be paid, and the program is taking that into account. So you're quite right that even though the tables is getting quite old, 2010 to the present date, but we get the fortunate benefit of having these projection scales be updated on an annual basis. It used to be that they were never updated. So we wait for the new mortality table to show up, but now the Society of Actuaries is giving us the tool to include the projection scale each and every year. As a matter of fact, they also tell us that they are going to update these tables more often. It usually used to be that those tables are not updated until maybe 10 or if not 20 years down the road. But now these tables will be updated more often as the need arises.
But as far as the math of it, though, again, it's you've got a probability of death. Unfortunately, we don't have the whole table here because it's a standard table, so we don't publish the whole table. But if you had a year where the probability of deaths was 0.5%, and the next year is going to be 0.5% times 0.99, a little bit less than 0.5%. For the next calendar year. So the whole table, each probability of death gets a little bit smaller as you advance in each calendar age. That's how we anticipate mortality improvement.
Okay. Yeah. I hope that 1% is accurate.
Yeah. They, there's a lot of debate about it. Yeah. We also get questions, by the way, about which way COVID is going to go, and the jury is out on that. We don't know, for example, whether the folks who did not die from COVID are going to live longer. It's a select group. or how is long COVID going to play in? So there has not yet been an explicit adjustment in the tables either way going forward for COVID mortality. And that's where it would show up. It will the thing about these projection scales, you need a lot of data. They actually use, for the projection scale, not the base table. Base table is based upon public sector experience. But for the mortality projection tables, they use a Social Security database, so it's a more general population database. But yeah, so it's a very slow improvement, but it is also very steady, and they do monitor that every year. Okay. So again, the only thing I was gonna look at in the on the mortality issue is if you go, we're on 47. Let's just go forward to page 51. And again, this isn't going to tell you a whole lot, except that what you'll see is, at least for the period of this study, the red is the number of expected deaths, but they're expressed in dollars, not in head count, because the last study you went to something called dollar-weighted mortality, because it turns out people with higher benefits live longer. So instead of looking at how many a head count, how many deaths there will be, we actually look at how many dollars of benefit will stop being paid. So we now measure that. And all that's shown here is that under your current table, the red bars, which are the ones on the far left, for male, female, and total, the top is general, the bottom is safety. It was whatever it is. The actual mortality during this study period was greater than expected. And you'll see here, you'll notice that the period is from 2011 to 2022. We actually used, Andy, I guess it would be
Three-year experience study.
three studies, yeah, so it's 9 years.
Oh, yeah, you're right, 4.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Yeah.
So there's 12 years of data. So it's actually data from four different study periods.
Mm-hmm.
And even added together, we still don't have enough local Mendocino Serra data to move away from the standard table. And that's why what you see is the recommended in blue, the far right, is very similar to the current expected, because we're really just taking the same standard table, that same public 2010 table, and just advancing it 3 more years using the new projection scale. That is all we have to say on the demographic assumptions. So absent any questions, we're now going to turn to the main event, which is the economic assumption.
Well, so would demographics or it be economics that's looking at, say, projected earnings by county employees? Is that economics?
That is under economics, yes.
Okay.
It's sort of a hybrid assumption, actually, but we lump it in with the the economic assumption.
And what about, in the report, it also has an estimated 65% of the employees transferring to a reciprocal agency. Is that economics or demographics?
So that's all in the demographics. Okay. Yeah, and that is also very much experience-based.
Well, could we talk about that one?
Sure. Andy, what page is that? I don't know where to
On
park
page
that.
37.
37. So 37, we talk about a reciprocity assumption. And Andy, you want to walk us through this one? I know we're keeping it at 65%.
Yeah, so what happened is, at the date when the member terminates employment with the county or the participating employers, we ask the system to provide us with where did the employee go. Of course, if the employee, for example, which happened quite a bit to folks from Mendocino County, they end up working at another assignment, a different employer at Sonoma County, for example. So as we all know, if they were to retire from another 37 Act system, in this hypothetical example, Sonoma County Employee Retirement Association, their pension benefits, even the ones that they have earned at Mendocino, will be calculated based on the final average salary with their system, which would be higher compared to what would end up happening if we just use the MSERA data. So we got that assumption from the association as to how many of those members actually went to work for so-called reciprocal employer. I think one of the reasons why, as Paul is right in pointing out, that even though we are not recommending a change in the assumption, but we find out from talking to the association that there could be something that can be done to at least enhance the accuracy of that reciprocal assumption. So in any event, we are making no recommendations to propose any changes. It remains at 65%.
And that's even though the observed proportion of reciprocal members among your deferred vested members, people who have a deferred claim, is actually a little higher than 65 because of our conversation with staff that number may be coming under more control. That's why we elected to maintain the current assumption of 65% instead of possibly moving it to 70 or something closer to 60.
So how would MSARA staff be able to look into a crystal ball and project what is likely to occur in the future there? Because MSARA staff does not vote on county contracts, does not necessarily, in all due respect, are not necessarily experts in the county budget and maybe the thinking of the county in terms of what their strategy is for future salaries. You know, in other words, it seems to me that it's sort of outside of their realm of subject area matter expertise, other than to observe what has happened in the past, not what might be happening in the future.
Yeah, and I will throw that to Doris, but I think that's all that's being stated. It's not that they're going to try to predict it. They're going to say we're going to be able to monitor more carefully and accurately which deferred vested members are in fact in reciprocal status. Doris, I think that's where we're going.
So we are looking at just historical data. We are making some improvements to the data extraction that we have that would give us a better understanding when we report to our actuary whether they have incoming and or outgoing reciprocity. And it is not an assumption we're making, it's just a historical number that we're basing on our actual experience, but we're trying to get it a little more accurate by the way we code data that goes to the actuary.
Okay, but we're saying what we know right now is it's more than 65% have moved on to another agency.
Well, I guess we're saying we're not as confident in that as we'd like to be. Because that's where the refining and sort of pursuing the data more carefully could change that number.
Right. So in other words, right now, if we look at the data, it would appear to suggest that more members left MSARA to work for a reciprocal agency because that percentage is 69%. However, when we were talking to MSARA staff, our understanding is that that indicator may not be that accurate because what we would like to have captured is really what members did after they left us. Did they go to work for a reciprocal agency? However, in that data, we found some evidence that in addition to tracking members who left to work for another reciprocal agency, that field may also capture folks who actually left another reciprocal agency and worked for MSARA at one point in time. So imagine that this number could be somewhat overstated, but we don't know by how many percent.
Okay. And an employee could also leave the county with the intention of working at one of 3 or 4 different agencies and not knowing actually when they leave. I mean, they may not have a job lined up and may not communicate that. I mean, how does MSARA even know because the reciprocity takes place within 6 months, how do they even know that in the 4th month they landed a job at some other agency?
You know, Mr. Sturdy, like all assumptions, it's going to be wrong. It's the nature of making assumptions. So we try to take as accurate a number as we can get. We have a number that's based on historical experience, and we simply chose to leave that bet where it is as MSARA goes through a process of trying to get more accuracy in that data.
And if I may add, even though not everybody knows they're going to go to work for a reciprocal employer, many of them do and will indicate such on their disposition form with us. However, if they leave, they just defer 4 months down the road, they go to a reciprocal employer that wasn't necessarily pre-planned when they left employment with us. One of the items when they go to the reciprocal employer as far as the intake of new employees is asking if they have reciprocal service that they want to establish reciprocity with another agency. So we receive a form from that other agency. Is it 100%? No, because the law only requires that they establish reciprocity before they retire. But the system certainly tried to make an effort to have people elect that reciprocity link at the start of their new employment. And so we get a form and we'll process the reciprocity in our system and code it as such for the data for the actuary. Is it ever 100% accurate? No, because we have to wait for the employee to act in certain circumstance.
Right, yeah. Yeah, and I think in addition to that, we are in discussion with Doris and her staff. So what happened is, even after a member came back to MSARA, indicating to us that they have now established reciprocity because, for example, they are now working at Sonoma County Sonoma County. We think that it would be, it would enhance the accuracy of that data gathering process if we go back to Sonoma County Employee Retirement Association from time to time and ask, is this particular employee still working with you at the Sonoma County? So that way, even though the member left immediately with us and worked for Sonoma, we know that there's a reciprocity, but there's always the possibility that he or she decided to just quit that job right after 6 months. So in which case, we don't want to continue to anticipate salary increases will take place until the member retires from that other retirement association. I know that it's very burdensome, so that's why we still have to make sure that staff has the capability and the time to actually conduct that survey. I think we have been working for another system down south at Imperial County where, quite candidly, they have a lot of members, just like ourselves in here, who left Imperial County to work for San Diego. So they were the training ground for San Diego, and I think likewise, I think we think of MSERA as a training ground for Sonoma County. So in which case, I think it is even more important for us to establish that kind of a practice, but I know that it's very burdensome, therefore we are not insisting or pushing that down to staff, at least as of yet.
Any other questions on demographics? Okay, so we'll now move to the economic assumptions. And those start on page 11. And there are three principal economic assumptions, cost of living, or CPI, inflation that is, or CPI, and that is both its own assumption, but is also used as a component of other assumptions. It is a driver of the assumed actual cost of living increases. It's a driver of salary increases, and is a driver of investment returns. So the inflation assumption actually gets used as a component of three other assumptions: COLA, investment return, and salary increases. So we'll start with this. So now this will be one of probably the most counterintuitive recommendation we're going to make. Your current inflation assumption is 2.75%, which was set to previous study, and before that it was 3, and before that was 3.25, and before that was 3.5. We have a graph we'll show in a second where it's been coming down steadily, about 25 points in each study. It is heading toward what we believe is its sort of natural resting place, which is where we are getting with this study, where we're recommending a reduction from 2.75 down to 2.5%. And we actually expect that you will not be hearing, just like mortality, once we got to the generational mortality with the projection scales, mortality has become a kind of a boring assumption. It doesn't change much from year to year. We think the same is going to be true for inflation, but we have the last step to take now. So we've, compared to the study 3 years ago, we've revised this section. We used to have a bunch of historical averages of inflation, which we find were never very useful in terms of indicators of future inflation. So here, just as a snapshot, we show on page 11 a graph of past actual inflation year by year, and then just are the 2.5 they're recommending just as a line to see going across there. This does not tell you the answer, but it does point out that while the last 30 years or so, really, from 1990 to 2020, have been relatively stable, there were in the past, and I lived through and was a professional in the, I started working in 1978, so those two spikes that you see there in between 1970 and 1985, those were within my memory. And the thing that we will point out is, you'd say, well, wait a second, Mr. Actuary, don't you know that we're in an inflation spike right now? Okay? Although even the current inflation spike, we'll show this in a second, has come down. The highest it ever was, the 12-month, from 12 months ago to now, highest it ever got was around 9%. They just came out with the April to April, and it's under 5%, so there is definitely some stabilizing there. But the real key is, if you turn to the next go 2 pages forward to page 13, the text on pages 11 and 12, we talk about, to try to find a forecast based on longer periods. There's a couple sources we look at. One is that the Social Security Administration, the text I'm reading is actually on page 12, the Social Security Administration, they do an annual report which includes a 75-year forecast made by their economists. They do a low, intermediate, and high. And that report about 2 years ago moved from 2.6% to 2.4%. But what we show on the, so that's one that we look at, okay? And so that is currently at 2.4. And the other one that economists and the financial advisors like to look at is you can actually get a market forecast of inflation by looking at the spreads, the differences in return between treasury bonds and notes and inflation indexed or TIPS treasuries notes. And so by comparing those two, there's a calculation you can do that gives you the market's implicit forecast. And if you look at 30-year securities, you get a 30-year. This is generally called the break-even rate. Now, this rate bounces around. And if you go to the next page on page 13, this shows going back to 2010, not only the Siegel assumption and your assumption, which is the green one on top. The blue one in the middle is the number from the Social Security Administration Trustees Report. And then the red one on the bottom is month by month, this 30-year break-even rate. Well, what's interesting to notice is if you look at the table at the top of page 13, okay, even during this period of very high, this inflation bubble that we are in, even during that period of time, the only time that this 30-year break-even rate got close to 2.5% was in March and April of 2022. That was the year when the 1-year inflation was over 9%. Okay? So even at that moment, this market forecast, which we don't take as gospel, but it is, it's an objective measure, it just sort of brushed against 2.5%, and then it quickly went back to its more more recent standard form, which is around 2.25%. Now, as we say in the last page of this section, there is no formula for us coming up with our recommendation here. But what this graph really shows in the bottom, the blue one, which is our recommendation and MSARA's assumption, is that starting back when we started doing public sector work here in California, the inflation assumptions way back then, which is back in 2004, that we inherited from previous actuaries was actually up around 4 and 5%. And as we saw the actual inflation go to much lower levels, as you might remember, we had a whole series of years up until this recent spike where inflation was hovering around 2%. Now, here's the punchline. Back in those days, we would come in here with our 2.75 or a 3% recommendation. We would be asked, come on, Mr. Actuary, haven't you read the papers? Inflation's at 2%. Why don't you move your assumption down to 2%? That's what the Fed is targeting, and they're hitting that target for many years. And what we said at the time was, we don't know when and we don't know why, but somewhere out in the future, remember now, pretend now it's 2008. Somewhere in the future, there's going to be an inflation spike. We don't know what's going to cause it, and we don't know how big it's going to be, or when it's going to happen. But our 275 and our current 250 recommendation is basically that target Fed rate of 2% plus a margin for future inflation spikes, including the one that we are now in. So what we view as the current inflation spike, it's an accident of timing that you happen to be making this decision in the middle of it, but the 2.5% actually anticipates this inflation spike and the next one, and we don't know when that'll be either. So I hope you can see there's actually a program here of gradually over time moving this step down, and we're now recommending that you take the last step. And we think that with that, you will not be hearing much about us from inflation for a while, unless, I don't know, suppose the Fed gives up on 2%. Suppose the Fed, 20 years from now, when Andy's still here and I've retired, 20 years from now, the Fed says, oh, now we're aiming at 2.5 because we don't think we can get back down to 2. Then we will reopen this book. But as long as the Fed is targeting 2%, as long as they seem to be making progress in that direction, we think that 2.5% is a very stable place to be. And that's also, by the way, a very, very common assumption for public plans around the country.
So we just went through a period since the 1980s of offshoring, where manufacturing was not taking place in the United States. It's been taking place partly through free trade agreements anywhere other than the United States, essentially, and a change in the U.S. economy. And that offshoring of manufacturing has essentially created deflation in certain goods and products. I mean, think of a television, for example. In 1980, you might have bought a 21-inch color television I don't know, $400 or $500 today for the same price or less, you could buy a high definition, much larger television, thanks to offshoring of manufacturing and and that. So, but what we've been seeing is that people are speculating that trend is actually going to be reversing. Certain things are going to be onshored, either on the United States or on the American continent, for transportation purposes, for diversifying supply chains, and that we're likely to not see that same disinflation influence on the economy through goods prices continually going down, because for other reasons, we're wanting those products to be manufactured in places not exclusively, let's say, in China. And India, they say the difference between India and China isn't so much the population, it's more maybe the government function there. It's centralized in China. They can sort of work with a corporation like Apple and build a whole city around an Apple factory, have people live in kind of maybe inhumane circumstances in that city. India has got state governments. It's very, balkanized the way they work. And so it's harder for a corporation to move into India and get that same sort of lightning speed, build a city, build a factory in India the way they could in China. And there aren't other countries that have the massive population other than India and China to build whole city factories around one company in the same way that they could in China. So for a variety of reasons, I've been seeing that people are saying that they don't think we're in spite of what the Fed's saying, that we're ever going to get back to the 2%. That actually Wellington and some other companies are saying that we're likely to see more volatility in inflation, and that the average might be 3 instead of 2, but it's not going to be 3 every year. It could be 6 one year, 0 the next. So that what we've seen since the 1990s is unlikely to reoccur, and that so it just seems to be that what I'm seeing outside of this meeting very much contradicts what your assumption that you're making here.
And again, I guess that we would probably point to that 30-year break-even rate. I would imagine that the markets are informed by those conversations, and yet that break-even rate is still comfortably below 2.5.
Of course, that's with the Fed publicly saying 2% is still their target until they don't.
Yeah, and there's some data that has to emerge before it enters into our model. So at this point, I think that we're very comfortable with the 2.5%. So that's inflation. Now you're going to hear a lot about inflation because, as I said, it shows up in the next 3 assumptions. If we take that as sort of our starting point, the next thing that we look at is retiree cost of living increases. Now here we are doing this is something that is new here at MSERA. Historically we have linked. First of all, we're talking only about the non-CalPEP tiers, which have a maximum 3% COLA. Okay, your CalPEP tiers, a table there. If we go to page 14, the table at the bottom shows that the maximum COLA for the non-CalPEP tiers is 3, and for CalPEP is non-applicable. We have historically set the COLA assumption equal to the inflation assumption. However, as we have been taking plans from 275 down to 250 on inflation, as far as the COLA, if you move the COLA assumption down to 2.5%, that means anytime you actually pay a 3% COLA, that will show up as an actuarial loss of 50 basis points. Under your current assumption of 2.75, if you pay an actual 3% COLA, in that particular year, you will actually have a loss for that 25 basis points. Which, going the other way, in the years when you only had 1% COLAs actually paid, that was a 1.75% gain. So what we're recommending here is, even though we are lowering the price inflation assumption to 2.5, we are recommending leaving the COLA assumption at 2.75. You can look at this of one of 2 ways. You can either call it what the actuaries call a margin for adverse deviation, that is, it's just some additional conservatism, or you can actually look at the fact that because your COLAs are not based upon a national CPI, they're based on a Western state CPI, and in the 5-year, 10-year, and 20-year periods from the middle of this page, the change in December CPI for the Western region has been consistently higher than the U.S. city average. And the U.S. city average is what we use as the basis for that general price inflation assumption, partly because it's also used to drive investment returns, which is more of a national phenomenon. So here, we're actually injecting a little bit of conservatism by leaving the COLA assumption at 2.75, even though for other purposes, investment return and salary growth, we're lowering inflation down to 2.5. This is a break-even assumption, but it actually is a change in methodology by introducing this margin between the CPI and the COLA assumption.
So you said little bit of conservatism. I think the emphasis is on the word little. I mean, you know, I can't imagine that many employees will retire anytime in the next 10 years with less than a 3% CPI based on the Western Division. And it's also important to remember that everybody who retired in 2021, 2022, and extremely likely at least in 2023 is not just retiring with 3% COLA that year and in 2022 and in 2023, but they're also banking the difference between that year's inflation for the Western Division and 3%. So that we already have a cadre of everybody we already know for fact, just looking back in the rearview mirror, we already know that everybody retired in 2021, 2022, they banked, you know, 3, 4, 5% towards that. So
Let me address the bank, because actually, as separate from the assumption, we actually value the entire bank in the valuation.
okay, but aside from that, seeing how the Western Division, and we've always known this, has a higher inflation rate than the country because, you know, again, these are the urbanized areas within the Western region. It's not rural Western counties. It's the urbanized areas. You know, we don't have Mississippi in the cadre here. We don't have places where people are exiting. No one's moving into those states. We have places that are growing in population, desirable weather, desirable states. I see no reason why to think that the CPI won't continue to outpace the national rate. And we've seen that it's the last 10 years, it was over 3%. That's with offshoring of manufacturing, with less offshoring opportunities left to create de-inflation within the United States. I think the 2.75 is not conservative in any way. I think if we don't have a 3% assumption for the COLAs for our employees, for the retirees that are classic employees, I think we're building in a deficit. We're building in a future unfunded liability into the plan.
On an expected basis, we think that 2.75 is a reasonable assumption, which is your current assumption.
Yeah, and that was when we actually thought the Fed could achieve 2-point inflation, and that's when there wasn't onshoring taking place. I mean, guys, if you go to if anyone's built a house or remodeled a house recently, you say someone's doing some sheet metal fabrication or whatever. That metal came from China or some other place. 20, 30 years ago, that sheet metal, the copper, whatever, would have come maybe from the United States at a much higher cost. I mean, we've been benefiting in so many ways from cheap imports. And it's not that the imports are going to end, but we're not going to see a decrease in costs for those imports the way we saw in the past, which was counterbalancing other upward pressures that you have in natural inflation in the economy.
I have a question related to COLA. Does it come into effect when you were making your recommendation that we obviously aren't adding any more members that would have a COLA, so that number would obviously get lower as those groups continue to retire out and PEPRA members do not have a COLA?
Yeah.
And that is also coupled with the fact that people are expected to live longer as we continue to go into those generations. Is that considered in your assumption?
Yes, both of those are. We value the two tiers completely separately.
Okay.
And so when we're running the non-Cal PEPRA, we use the 2.75. When we're valuing the PEPRA members, we value no COLA. So
Yeah.
those are done completely separately. And then as far as longevity, I mean, anytime we project people are living longer, the COLA assumption will be in effect longer, and that will automatically get picked up.
Yeah, because I'm assuming when the majority of this board's retired and we're looking 25, 30 years down the road, there are going to be very few non-PEPRA members remaining in our system unless they just want to work for the duration of their life.
Right. And again, each one, we basically have probabilities of, how long you're going to keep working, and then once you retire, how long you're going to live. And all of those carry the COLA assumption if you are in a traditional tier. Exactly right.
Thank you. Yeah, Trustee Anderson.
Quickly, because I want Trustee Jurdy to know I appreciate your thoughts and your comments. I think one of the difficulties which the actuaries are describing is that we need data, and kind of what you're doing and what we attempt to do as trustees is to do some futuring. I mean, we're looking out there, and whether it's actuarial gains because mortality rates come down because of COVID, whether it's an increase as you described in the cost of living adjustments to retirees and so forth. I think we can all look out there and look at a myriad of variables that may change the assumptions we use when we go through this exercise again 3 years from now, 6 years from now, 9 years from now. The difficulty is that it hasn't created data yet. And I just want to let you know that I respect your thoughtfulness about all of the things that could impact our plan into the future. It's just whether or not that data is available for us to make actionable decisions on at this time.
Vice Chair Shoemaker.
So I actually had a similar response after 7.5 before I heard Dan's talk, and so what I wondered about was how many of our folks that are in the banking situation on the COLAs, how many there are in that, and how much the value is, how far out that will go. Will it guarantee if inflation settled in at 2.5% for a while, how long would it take to eat that up? And why isn't it 3 to eat it up faster?
If Andy told me the number is 28, I'm gonna let Andy get to that number in a second, but the idea is Andy will walk you through with the recent inflation spike. I think you've got banks at around 7%, you told me, Andy. So the way our valuation works is we're assuming 2.75, okay? And so that means that for every year, for someone who is in the tier and has a bank, we assume that they're going to get the 3% COLA, which means that 7% bank will actually last 4 times 7, 28 years, which means that for a person with a 7% bank, we're actually valuing 28 years of a 3% increase as they run down the bank. Then and only then do we assume that they'll get to 2.75. So all of that, that's one reason why when you have a big bump in inflation and you're in a 3% tier, you might think, well, we're not going to get a very big loss because it's only 3%. No, the entire 7% actually shows up in your next valuation in your liability because we burn the COLA bank off at a 1/4 point a year. Why a 1/4 point? 3% actual of the actual minus the 2.75 assumption. So yeah, we actually have built in 28 years. I get that right, Andy? 28 years of actual 3%. Then it will drop to the assumed CPI of 2.75. So we burn that off.
Right. So if I may add, for the 7% COLA bank that Paul was referring to, that applies to our members who retired between 1983 and 2022. So in our valuation program, that's practically most of our retirees, right? And if you retire before 1983, the banks are even higher. So we go through the same math, and we basically assume, practically speaking, for the rest of their lifetime, at least for the current retirees, that they will draw the 3% COLA. That's already built into the cost structure of the plan. However, Dan is quite right that for future retirees, those who have not yet retired from the plan, if we were to come to you around January, February of next year and recommend, because of the higher elevated CPI, let's say that the COLA the CPI came in again at 7% or something even higher, then you're right that we're building a bank for those retirees for the first time, no new retirees, and then we would associate the cost of the much longer payout of a 3% COLA for the rest of the lifetime of those retirees. So what we are saying is, based on the evidence that we have today, we think that might happen next year, but it will not happen forever. We think that the Fed will continue to do a good job, and I think they risk even going into a recession, right? I think the R word has been mentioned several times in the newspaper article. So we don't want to think that the Fed do not have the will to do that. But you're right. until they give up, I think we would we'll be very comfortable in recommending 2.5, which is arguably already 50 basis points higher than what the Fed has signaled as the long-term rate of inflation.
But 275 though for the COLA,
Absolutely.
even for a new retiree, or a new retiree.
So this calculation it sets up the entire contribution numbers for both employees and the employer, correct?
For PEPRA, yes.
For the
Yeah.
non-PEPR members.
For the non-PEPRA members, I'm sorry, yes.
So the PEPRA members aren't held together with everybody. They're not subsidizing this.
No, totally separate,
Thank
totally
you.
separate, yeah. Yeah, completely different member contribution calculation for PEPRA versus legacy or traditional.
The way the PEPRA members, which is actually a majority of our current employees, are actually subsidizing the COLA, is that when there is unfunded liability generated because we've underestimated the cost of the COLA, then what the PEPRA members are seeing is a drag on future county wages. Because there's something, I was just going through the reports here, and in 2011, the county was contributing just under 4% of all county revenues to the pension system. Today, or actually in 2021, it was just under 9% of all county revenues. That's including state and federal grants for capital projects. I'm saying all county revenues. Now it's grown, it's more than doubled from 2011 to 2021 in 11 years. And another way of looking at that is the county's contribution has increased by about 340% during that time period. A lot of it's unfunded liability that's been, and I've supported reducing the assumed investment return up until now. I mean, I think the county, we've been pretty prudent in lowering it to 6.75. I don't see why we can't beat 6.75 with a better mix in our investment portfolio. And so I don't think we need to, lower our assumed rate of return. And there's two ways of doing that. One is we could keep the 6.75 and not lower the inflation rate, keep the status quo, and that would have less of an impact on the county general fund than what's being proposed here today. Because what's being proposed here today is putting more unfunded liability on the books, which falls entirely on the plan sponsor, nothing coming from the employees when we put more money on the unfunded liability. And what it becomes is a hidden tax on the employees that they don't even see it on their paycheck, how much the county's contributing to the retirement system. They only see what's coming out of their paycheck for the employee contribution. And unfortunately, that hurts recruitment for the county, because the county, when people are shopping around for jobs, they look at the top line, what's the salary? Then they start to look at some of the benefits. They don't know that one employer is paying into CalPERS a different amount than another employer who's paying into CalPERS, even if they offer the exact same plan. They don't know if the County of Mendocino has a plan that is roughly equal or equal to a CalPERS plan offered by another agency, but the County of Mendocino is contributing substantially more to fund that plan than the other agency. They're just seeing what's the top line salary, what's the benefit. They're not seeing how much is being taken out of someone's paycheck or how much the employer is paying and therefore doesn't have money for contribution. In fact, I've talked to people who don't even know, county employees who don't even know the City of Ukiah, County of Napa are not in Social Security, which is a 6.34 contribution rate by the employer, and it's an incredibly valuable benefit that the County of Mendocino offers employees, but those two employers that we compare our salaries with aren't enrolled in Social Security. So the awareness of employees when they're shopping around for jobs does not include how much money is the employer contributing towards the retirement plan. And so I think, I'm concerned that looking back, that almost every change, almost every reform we've made in our contribution rates, which I've supported to prop up the retirement system, almost all of those reforms have fallen disproportionately on the employer and not shown up in the paychecks for the employees who are actually getting the benefit. So it becomes a hidden cost to operations for the county that other employers are not bearing, because every time we make these changes, we always seem to make them in a way that it falls disproportionately. So in your report, I think you show that when we make these economic assumption changes, the way they fall out is for every dollar extra that the employer is putting in, the employee is putting in about 15 cents. And when we make changes to the assumptions about longevity or something that's related to the actual beneficiary, it's about $1 from the county and about 40 cents from the employee. So even under the most favorable considerations for the county, it's still like the county's putting in $1 for every 40 cents the employee's putting in extra. And so at what point can the county afford, and I'd say we're at that point, that the county can't afford to keep putting more money in per employee unless we're going to start cutting wages for county employees or having massive layoffs because, there is no money. I've been talking to county executive staff. They're looking at developing next year's budget. The entire time I've been on the board, we've never used one-time revenues to pay for ongoing expenses. In next year's budget, crafting next year's budget, for the first time, the county's looking at using about $7 million in one-time revenues, which we can't expect. We're not going to get ARPA money again. We're looking at using one-time monies for the first time that I've been on this board just to pay for salaries and ongoing expenses. That's how tight the county budget is. And I think that this would be a disaster if we lower the assumed rate of return and lower the inflation rate because it's all going to fall on the county, and the county doesn't have the money.
I think we have a preview of what our next topic is. So unless there's any other questions about inflation in particular, we'll now move to the expected rate of return, which Mr. Jurdy has anticipated in his comments.
Yeah, I guess maybe one more comment I want to make about the inflation assumption because Dan, you mentioned about CalPERS. As you know from reading our report, we did mention that CalPERS actually has an inflation assumption even lower than what we are recommending because recently in 2019, they actually recommend and their board approve a 2.3% inflation assumption. So definitely lower than what we are recommending today, just a data point.
I got that. However, CalPERS state employees have a COLA of 2%. State employees have never had a 3% COLA. CalPERS members have always, Classic, Pepper, either have always had a 2% COLA for retirees. They've never had a 3%. County of Mendocino, for Classic employees, has always had a 3%.
Okay. Any other questions about COLA? So we're now going to move to page 16. We're talking about the investment return. And if things are going to get even more complicated now because after 15 years of applying a very consistent model, we, Siegel in California, our public sector practice is making a change in the model that we use to develop our expected return assumption. And it's described the changes are described in some detail on page 19. I'll give you an overview. There are two, and what the change that we're making is actually moving to a model that is more commonly used by other public sector actuaries. Siegel's practice in this area goes back many, many years. Andy started working on 37 Act County plans 2 companies ago at a place called Coates, Hereford in England. And back then, the model used, it was different from what, it differed from what we're going to be moving to in 2 ways. The first one is a little easy, is kind of hard to get your hands around. And it has to do with something called forward-looking expected arithmetic average returns and forward-looking expected geometric average returns. If I was trying to find something more complicated than that, I don't know if I'd be able to. But the idea is that in theory, if you think that your return every year is, I'll use 7 just as a round number, that you can actually set your discount rate at 7. And what that means is on an expected value basis, on a present value basis, your expectation, you would expect in the future to have no surplus and no shortfall. That's not the same as there being a 50-50 chance of having no surplus and no shortfall. Now, how can those 2 things be different? Well, we have a footnote on page 20 that explains that, because if you look at a distribution of outcomes, you can get some extremely high results, whereas you can't lose more than all your money. And so if you're looking at each possible outcome times the probability of that outcome and getting an average, that is shifted up by these very high outliers. Whereas if you're just looking for a median, half lower, half higher, well, once you're higher than half, whether you're a little higher or a lot higher doesn't change it. So the median return is lower than this, an actuarial expected value return. So Siegel has traditionally used that higher number. That is anti-conservative. It's a higher real return. Going the other way, Siegel has traditionally calculated gross expected returns. We get capital market assumptions from the investment consulting community, gross of investment expenses, gross of active management expenses. And then we deduct those active management expenses explicitly. So we basically don't give you any credit in advance for active management. We use indexed returns, but then we charge you for the cost of active management. Well, that is conservative. And for most plans over many years, that is generally canceled out. We always include in our report, we have for the last several reports, we basically run that other model just to see how the confidence level under that model compares to the one under ours, and they've always been fairly comparable. But for a couple of reasons. First of all, the surveys that we get from the investment consultants, more and more, they are coming to us net of expenses. So we would actually have to add expenses into the capital market assumptions in order to then deduct them as a separate line. And so one reason we're moving to using net of expenses is because that's the information we get from the capital market survey. It is, and all this is in the text in the report, it is a permitted approach under the actuarial standard of practice. Under the actuarial standard of practice, you can't claim alpha, unless you prove it, but you only have to prove it net of expenses. You're allowed to assume that active management will cover its own cost and no more. And so and the third reason is, whenever we have actuarial audits done, all the other auditing actuaries that work public sector in California use the geometric and no reduction, net of expenses approach. And so it does move us somewhat into the mainstream. So it's a combination of moving to a more mainstream approach, also reflecting the fact that the data that we get from the capital market assumptions won't let us continue to do our old model. Now, what does this mean in terms of nuts and bolts? Let's go to page 21. At the top of page 21, we always show, these are the components, and each one of these components is described in detail in this section of the report. Let's just look at the left column. We have inflation. Okay, we start with whatever the inflation assumption is. That's the first building block. We do a survey of returns, and the survey is done on an arithmetic basis. There's a technical reason for that. If you want to be able to weight them by probability to get an average, that actually doesn't work with geometric returns. It only works with arithmetic returns. So that has actually gone up from 4.87 to 5.17. But we make a comment in the text. We are skeptical of that number. That is, the capital market assumptions that we're getting from this survey are like 100 points higher than they were a year ago. We think some of that is just because the market is so low. We're not sure that that is a reliable basis for a long-term assumption. You'll find those words at least 2 or 3 places in this section. So that's basically tailwind. So you got a 25-point downward pressure from the inflation. You've got about maybe 30 or 34 points upward, 30 points from the survey of capital market assumptions. Now on the expenses, we are leaving in here your administrative expenses. There's a table on page 18. About 24 basis points is your recent historical administrative expense. And your investment expense is relatively low because you're largely a passive investor. So for you in particular, this idea of no longer deducting investment expenses, that only gets you 10 basis points. We have another system where that got them 110 basis points, so varies by plan. So you get 10 points of relief there. Now comes the big one. This difference between being right on a present value basis or being right on a 50-50, a true median type of basis. For your plan, it's based upon standard deviation. It's a calculation. That's what we call 3 clicks on the dial. We measure this stuff in 25-point clicks, 0.25% measures. That's 77 basis points. That's a lot of downward pressure on the number. So if you net all that together, if you think of it as simply taking the 25-point drop in inflation and just let that drop right down to the nominal return, that alone would move the nominal return from 6.75 down to 6.5. All these other things, we still are comfortable with the 6.5 inflation, but it does mean that your confidence of hitting that number is lower than it historically has been. I also want to say that the confidence levels depend on what model you're using. So to some extent, we are recalibrating here. It's not an apples-to-apples comparison. Although we did, I mentioned that we do a comparison of this, a way of doing this new model that we've always done. Later in this section, when we run the geometric model last study, you were at 56%. If you run the geometric model this time, it's at 51%. So even there, on a more or less comparable basis, we see that with these other changes, you are moving to less confident, and that's by only going to 6.75. If you wanted to maintain the same sort of confidence level we had in the past, that 55 or 54 level, that would involve an additional drop down to 6.25, which we are not recommending.
Well, conversely, if the inflation factor was 2.75, the status quo, not dropping it to 2.5, wouldn't our total returns at 6.75 also be 51% probability?
Yes, sir. That's true. So inflation is a driver here.
Yeah, and so we've under lowballed inflation, in my opinion, in your report, and therefore reduced our expected rate, confidence level and rate of return at 6.5 down to 51%. I think the solution to this report is we keep this inflation at 6.75, keep our total adjusted return assumption at 6.75, and I think we can beat the 6.75 because I think the inflation is going to be at least 2.75. And I think, again, tweaking our investment portfolio, I think we can easily beat that with that as a background inflation figure.
That is clearly the main decision the board has to make today. So let me just wrap up the section we're talking about salary scale, just sort of get that done, then we will come back to this table. Okay, is that all right? Mr. Jurdy, is that okay? So if you go to page 24, salary increases, we actually look at three things. We start with price inflation, which we're recommending 2.5. There's also then a real across-the-board wage increase. This is as average wages increase faster than average prices. For that, we are maintaining our recommendation of 50 basis points. That's a little bit, it's hard to find real hard data on that. There is the State and Local Government Workers Employment Cost Index produced by the Department of Labor. They say that over the last 20 years, that spread between average wage growth for public sector employees and average price growth is from 50 to 80 basis points. So we're on the low end of that range. So that's the status quo. And then merit and promotion, this gets a little tricky. We actually take for each, it's described on page 25, we take for each member what their increase was in pay over the study period. And we actually looked at 2 study periods. Okay, so, and then we take the average increase, and then we subtract from that the increase in average wages. Those are 2 different things. So we back out the increases that everybody got, which, by the way, here in Mendocino were relatively high during the study period. We back that out, and then what's left is how individuals have advanced ahead of the averages based on your data. We've got one of those green, blue, red graphs. If we go to page 29, now again, this is already filtered out the across-the-board increases. We do it for general and we do it for safety probation separately. And again, as before, the red diamond is the current assumption. The solid green square is the actual, but just for the last 3 years. The circle, the light green circle, is of the last 2 studies. And that's where you can see there's a lot more noise in just the last 3 years, a little more stability. And then Andy and his team come in and we kind of split the difference for the blue triangles. But then this is on top of what would be across the board 3% increases. That's down from current. Currently, your assumption for across the board wages is the 2.75 price inflation plus 50 basis points real wage growth to get you to 3.25. So that also comes down because of the price inflation. If you maintained the price inflation at 2.75, then your across-the-board wage growth would stay at the current 3.25. Those 2 go together. So that's it. With that, I think if we could just to have something on the screen, if we could just put up that page. Where's the one with the table? Yeah, page 21. This concludes our prepared remarks, and again, we're recommending modifications in many assumptions, but probably the one that will draw the most attention is the lower price inflation and corresponding lower nominal return. Price inflation 275 down to 250, nominal return 675 down to 6.5%. Mr. Chairman, that's our prepared remarks.
Thank you. I appreciate your comments. Trustee Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Before we go into general discussion, Paul, when you, page 23,
23?
I kind of consider this as like the reality test. I appreciate the conservatism and the professionalism of Siegel in the actuarial calculations, but then you get into the reality of what are other systems doing. And clearly from the nationally to statewide to 37 Act, if we move forward with your recommendations today, then we are one of the two or three or four most conservative systems regarding our assumed rate of return, and also on the inflation assumption as well, which again is going to drive the less on the inflation assumption.
Less
but
than
it
that. All the
does-
275s that are in our shop, they're going to be here now 250, and so far we're 6 for 6.
But again, if you can walk us through a little bit on page 23.
Yes.
This universe of retirement systems, because there is a real burden on our plan sponsors.
Understood.
And when I look at this, typically what has happened with MSERA, as you know, you've been our actuaries long enough, is that there are some, whether it's the 37 Act systems like a Lacera or a larger system or CalPERS, we tend not to be leading the parade, so to speak. And so I'm kind of curious why the recommendation to aggressively go to this new assumed rate.
Yeah, I think first of all, the move to the 2.5 price inflation is not just Siegel, it's fairly universal. And again, we are coincidentally doing a large number of studies this year, like 11 of them, and of those, probably 8. Some of them were already at 2.5. They're going to stay at 2.5. We will be recommending this. This is not, this 2.5 is not, in case you didn't pick it up, this is not a Mendocino specific assumption. We think that this is where that number is heading for all of our plans. I think the reason that, right now there are two 37 Act systems that are at 6.5%. I think, Mr. Anderson, the reason is if you go to page 16, which is where we have your asset allocation, okay? Now, I see a lot of these tables. Let's see if we can get page 16. We see a lot of these tables. I've never seen one that only has 6 lines on it. That is, every investment any asset allocation for every allocation has a whole slew of new categories: private credit, private debt. That is, they've moved into these newer categories where the design is to get higher returns at low correlation, therefore without increasing your risk. And so this is one of the, I just have to call it simpler. And I think one reason that you might end up lower than a lot of the other 37 Act systems is that they are taking, I'm not going to call it I'll call it a more aggressive approach to asset allocation. That's the thing that jumped out at me. This is by far the most, the shortest list, and it doesn't have, it doesn't have a lot of the other categories. And those categories, they're the ones you see the net real rate of return. The highest one you see here in our column is 7.05 for ex-US equities. See, we see a lot where the private credit, the private debt, that number is in low double digits. You have some parts of the asset allocation that have a real return of 9, 10, 11%. We don't see those here. And that is why I think that even when the dust all settles, even if everybody gets to 2.5 price inflation, I think Mendocino, unless you change your asset allocation, will be on the lower end of that distribution. I think it's all page 16.
And just follow up on that comment is that, and this is just in speaking with trustees from other systems last Friday on a virtual roundtable, is that although our portfolio doesn't have as many asset classes, it's at 21% of fixed income, which is essentially kind of a hedging type of 20%. And then 80% is kind of like return seeking, I guess, as they call it, asset classes. And that 80-20 mix seems to be fairly consistent, regardless of how you slice up your 80%. And there are some illiquid ways that you can drive some higher returns. Because I don't know that 80-20% between income or return driving asset classes and 20% hedging is that much different than the other systems. It's just literally what it's invested in.
Yeah, and I think another observation is that if we go back now to page 23, I think Mr. Anderson is correct in pointing out that there are very few systems that are using 6.5% today, only 2 of those in the survey that we conduct. However, anecdotally, if we go back to our experience report from 3 years ago, when the board approved the 6.75% investment return assumption, back then there was only one plan that have used the 6.75. So I think anecdotally, I can read that to mean that our board is a little bit more conservative than the rest of the pack. You're not afraid to go to a lower investment return assumption because since you take the move to become the second system in the survey to go to the 6.75, now we have 8 of those systems. So it's very possible that, at least anecdotally, looking at the past actions taken by the board, we kind of lead the pack in being more conservative. I think that.
Which also could tie into asset allocation. It could be that even 3 years ago, your asset allocation led you to move to 6.75 ahead of the pack. I think it's, I mean, you know, we try not to just make the decisions based on what other folks do, but it's also good to know where you live in the pack. And so I think what Andy's saying is this is consistent with your most recent practice.
If I could ask a question or make a comment, MSERA is probably the most mature 37 Act plan in the state as far as our ratio of inactive retiree members to our active population and the amount that we have committed for benefit payments because our retiree pool is larger than our actives. And with that, our board has been perhaps less motivated to move into more illiquid assets because we are advancing on that maturity scale. And I just wanted to ask if any of your other clients are addressing being that far advanced on the maturity life of their plan and in illiquid assets in their portfolio allocation.
You know, I think, Doris, that the way they manage that is looking less at that sort of support ratio, you know, inactives to actives, and more at what the plan's net cash flow is. That is, how do contributions compare to benefit payments? And I think that what we generally do is we give the investment teams, you know, a cash flow forecast, so they know if they are cash flow negative on a pure benefits to contribution, how much do they need in current income in order to fill that gap? And then once they do that, once they can cover payroll, then I think they feel then they're free to go less liquid. So I don't think the support ratio, that ratio of actives to inactive actives, drives that as much as they manage the net cash flow. And then only after that is covered, you know, I mean, that might put some drain. You know, they have to keep a certain amount in cash, or they have to keep a certain amount in income generating investments like, you know, rents and dividends, interest rates and dividends. But then once they've done that, I think then they feel free to take on more risk to take less liquidity on the balance of it.
I think we're, around 1.5% on the cash flow, negative cash flow annually. It was over 1.25. Okay.
Yeah, that's, for a plan your size, that's big.
With that, we don't structure our portfolio to necessarily spin off cash for that. We're fully committed to that asset allocation and will rebalance or take funds from equities or wherever it might be to fund cash needs for benefit payments throughout the year.
Yeah, but I want to add to Paul's comment that yes, of course, Callan is very careful whenever before they recommend an change in assets allocation, the first thing they ask the actuary to do, rightly so, is to make sure that we provide them with the cash flow. So I think they take that into account. It's not meant to, I think the comments expressed my point may appear to suggest that, oh, they are being very conservative. That's not, because they take your situation into account. Just like when we recommend assumptions, we take your situation into account in recommending retirement rates, inflation, and whatnot in our experience study.
So I'd like to offer a motion that we direct Siegel to bring back, we have your proposal as you've presented it, but to bring back at our next meeting an alternate proposal that the board could consider side by side, which would retain the 2.75 inflation factor, would retain the 6.75 back or assumed rate of return, and would elevate, what I think is more realistic, the inflation factor for the retiree COLA at 3%, rather than at 2.75. And I'd like to see that at our next meeting to compare the two side by side.
Trustee Jurdy, the COLA cost being projected for our current retired members is 3% for those folks who have the bank. They are building that in, but the assumption on a go-forward is that the long-term inflation factor would be 2.75, but they do build in the cost because of the COLA bank for all of our retired members, where it's already being projected at 3% for our assets, or rather our liabilities there.
I understand that, but I think we might be looking at a future where in the next 10 years at least, where we may only have 1 year where we have inflation of less than 3%. As measured in the Western Division.
But in that case, that would be, well, so that's fine. So as I understand, the request would be, in effect, we would be retaining the margin that we are recommending. That we're recommending a margin of 250 inflation and 2.75 price of COLA. And so what is being suggested is we leave inflation at 2.75, but then add in or retain our new recommendation, which is to have another 25 points margin for the COLA assumption. So it'd be COLA at 3, price inflation 275, which really is consistent with what, I think that's what you said.
I said three things. One is retain the existing 2.75 inflation.
Yes.
Retain the 6.75 investor
Yes,
return.
naturally.
And have the COLAs pegged at, the assumed COLAs would be at 3%, not 2.75.
Right. So in effect, that if you take our recommendation, all you do is move the inflation back to 275. Those other two things will happen naturally. That will push the nominal return from 650 up to 675, and it would push the COLA assumption from our recommended 275 up to 3%. We're saying the same thing.
Okay. That's why I would like to see it at our next meeting.
Now, by the way, it is possible. The COLA one threw me off. If the only question was, to keep inflation at 275 and the keep inflation 275 and the nominal return at 675, Andy, I think we have not run those numbers, but we'd be able to get cost impact for it.
It will be an increase in the cost, not as much as what we show in the report today, but it would still be an increase.
So the net effect is there would be more money going into the plan, but it would not be as significant of an increase as proposed here.
Okay, we have a motion on the floor. Are there any other trustees that have any other conversation, or is there a second? Trustee Anderson.
Just given the dialogue that just happened, could we have the motion read back?
Ms. Zeller?
So I understood that it was direction to show at the next board meeting an alternate proposal where we would keep the 2.75 inflation rate, 6.75 assumed rate of return, and increase the inflation COLA rate to 3% and compare that version side by side with this version.
Yeah.
I believe there was a motion, but I may have misunderstood Trustee Jurdy's intention.
I was suggesting a motion, it could be direction of the board, but, you know, I was suggesting that we have this brought back at our next meeting.
Understood. Is there any public comment regarding this presentation? I'm not considering it a motion at this point.
I don't know if I can do public comment. Would it be in order to entertain a motion to adopt the actuary's recommendation in lieu of the direction?
We can.
There is no public comment.
Thank you. So we have a recommendation, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Trustee Jurdy, for direction to Siegel to represent your requested changes at next month.
Yeah, I think it'd be helpful for the board to see the costs of both alternatives.
Thank you. Is there any other motion or ambitions or directions from anyone else on the board?
I would support Trustee Jurdy's request.
Thank you, Trustee Hubison. Vice Chair Shoemaker?
Take a minute and do a quick rundown. Does that affect these changes? Would you like to throw in the future costs and so forth?
Thank you, and we failed to include that in our report, Mr. Chairman. I stopped a little too soon. If we go to page 66 of the report. Sorry, Judy. So here we see the cost impact. We show first the impact on the average employer rate. We show them by tier on the next page, but you can see the largest impact is the economic assumptions, which is about 2.58%. Again, that's driven principally by the lower discount rate going from 675 down to 650, offset by lower salary growth, because the lower inflation also pulls the salary scale down by 25 points, but not offset by any lower COLAs, because we left that at 275. Demographics, not offset by the lower COLA. Lower COLA makes salaries grow less, but it does not, lower CPI makes salaries grow slower, but in this case, it does not make the COLA go slower because we left that at 275. Usually when you lower price inflation, it lowers your discount rate, which increases cost, but also lowers both salaries and COLAs, which tend to reduce costs. They offset each other. Well, you're not getting that offsetting effect because we're not changing the COLA assumption. That's why the 2.58 shows up there. For the demographic assumptions, the principal impact here is actually on the salary scale, where we valued the longer service people with higher retirement rates. Well, they're the higher liability people, so that tended to be, that's actually a cost increase. On the employee side, it's about 40 points each. And as Mr. Jurdy pointed out, because in the increases in, the members are only affected by the increase in the normal cost, which is just the year-by-year cost of each year of service. Whereas the employer pays the unfunded liability, and since, as you can see in the bottom of this table, this increases the unfunded liability by about $18 million. That is amortized under your policy, and that's entirely employer costs, as Mr. Jurdy pointed out earlier in his remarks. On the next page, page 67, we see how this breaks down tier by tier. As with all averages, there's highers and lowers, but there you can see that distribution. The only caution I would make with regard to the proposed direction is we caution boards to distinguish between results-driven assumption setting and results-aware assumption setting. I mean, we try to caution boards is that if the only thing you don't like about our assumption is that it costs too much, that's not generally a valid reason. Now, Mr. Jurdy has raised many other objections. I'm not saying that's what's happening here, but you have to be real careful about getting two sets of assumptions and just looking at the price tag and thinking that gives you your answer. That's not how good assumptions get set. I would caution the board in that direction.
So,
Mr. Shoemaker, does that give you what you wanted?
Well, my question was, is there a quick calculation to the additional UAAL with the old assumptions versus the new ones?
You mean the ones recommended versus those proposed in the direction?
Yeah.
I'm looking at Andy, I don't think we have a couple too many moving parts, Andy? Do we have a comfort zone for that?
Yeah, I would say the final cost, at least on the economic assumption
66.
side, would come in at least over one half of what is represented on the page. So if I have to make a guesstimate, I would say instead of 2.58,
1.5?
yeah, it's half of that amount. So yes, it's
One and a
gonna-
half,
yeah,
one and a quarter?
Yeah.
So it might be 1.5 to 1.25% lower than what you're looking at on the page.
Right, for the employer. And for the employees, it could come in 10 basis points lower than what we are presenting on the page.
Don't write that down.
Exactly.
Very
Yeah.
rough, Justin. Very rough, Justin.
So on page 66, you do have the calculation for the increase in the UAAL and the change in funded percentage. And I guess those, to me, are kind of where my questions are landing. If we were to move to a 3% inflation, stay at the 3%, or excuse me, 2.75, and if we stayed at 6.75 for the expected rate of return, what does that do to these numbers, and what does that do to the employer contribution amount, sponsor contribution amount?
Our rough guess is instead of increasing by about 3.5%, it might increase by 2.5%.
Okay, so 2.5 mil, not 3 mil.
Right, something like that.
Okay. So it's not like those changes would eliminate the 3.5 or the 3 million that's in this.
Correct. Well, the
Projection.
0.98 would be unchanged.
Uh-huh.
And remember, what the direction is to leave all assumptions the same except, as they are currently, except increase the COLA assumption from the current 275 up to 3. That's a cost increase.
I understand and appreciate Siegel's advice regarding don't get caught in the cost-driven analysis, get caught in the fact-driven and performance-based analysis. And I appreciate what this board has talked about and directions to potentially consider investment allocation changes in the future. But I'm in a position where I'm at, and my consideration is that Siegel is giving us recommendations on what we've done historically and what we have currently in our plan. And those changes, in my opinion, as I sit on this board, could not be assumed or even considered until the next triennial study, when we would have a few years of data with those changes in effect. So that's where my concern is to ignore potentially the recommendations that Siegel has given us based on our current investment allocation, with the belief that we're going to change some of that in the next year potentially, and that may outperform what we currently are expecting.
Well, just so you know, the one textbook reason to do an out-of-cycle review of economic assumptions is if you change your asset allocation. If you do a material change in asset allocation, it would be an established practice to do an out-of-cycle review. And we can certainly do that. If you make a material change, and we can even, back of the envelope, we can take that little table I had and you know, put in the old allocation, put in the new, and we can tell you if it's even worth doing an interim study. But you don't feel that you are not allowed to do an interim study, especially if you have a material change in asset allocation. But you almost should.
I appreciate that. I think more information is always good if we have this other information to consider the entire picture of what we're trying to do here. But if we're going to ignore recommendations from those that are studying what we've done historically in the current status of our plan, and then make assumptions as a board that we will outperform what your expectations and maybe even Callan's expectations are if we make these changes, I feel like that's a cart before the horse picture.
There's a paper from the Academy of Actuaries called "Don't Put the Cart Before the Horse," and it exactly says you don't set your asset allocation to chase an investment return. You do it the other way around.
And I have a question for Executive Director Rentschler. I understand there is a timeliness associated with adopting some of these considerations or assumptions. What impact could it have if we pass this to next month, even though we don't have direct motion on the floor, to reconsider with the additional information?
Well, we are currently undergoing our actuarial audit, and part of that audit review is to look at the recommended assumptions and have the auditing actuary tell us if those assumptions being made by Siegel for the triennial study are reasonable. So we just provided this report to the auditing actuary and who is scheduled to present at next month's meeting in June. We may need to, do a little bit of a domino effect if we are yet taking a new report, the time to get a new report and provide that to our auditing actuary. This report, though, or not this report, but whatever assumptions the board wishes to adopt, we need to have that adoption done for the valuation that will occur this fall for the June 30, 2023 plan year ending. That valuation cycle starts ramping up in late August through November, where then Siegel presents the annual valuation report to the board, because whatever assumptions the board adopts will be used in this valuation for June 30 of this year. Did I miss anything there?
That's right, and I checked with Andy, if the board delays the actual adoption of the assumption until the next meeting, that would not disrupt our valuations.
Okay.
It may disrupt the audit, but it would not disrupt the valuations.
Thank you, I appreciate that input.
Sure.
Are there any other conversation, comments, or potential motions on this item before we move on with the direction that's been presented?
Is it a significant amount of work on your part to do that?
I think that would be a little bit of work, not too much, not as much as, for example, redoing the entire experience study, because after all, the direction from the board is to, in air quotes, only to study the impact of a higher, restoring the investment return assumption and restoring the inflation assumption, but only to put in a higher COLA. So it's a amount of work that we can definitely handle between now and the next board meeting.
Yeah, I think we're looking at a report letter. It's not gonna be a big bound thing. It's gonna be a letter, and it's gonna have 2 columns, The ones that's in here, and then a set of cost impacts under the alternative assumption.
And I think I personally would appreciate that A to B comparison, saying this is what we recommended, this is what we were requested to present.
definitely get that.
I figured we would.
Do
I am, do you have comment? Okay. I'm hearing no other motions, so we'll provide direction to Siegel and staff, and this item will otherwise be further passed until next month. I appreciate all your time and
Very good. Thank you
consideration.
all. Thank you very much.
I understand we've been going for quite a while. Is there a request to have a break before we move on? Okay, we will take a 10-minute break at this time. It is currently 10:12, so please be back by 10:22. 17th. That takes us to item number 2, discussion and possible action regarding investment matters. We'll lead off with Mondrian Investment Partners. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
Trustees, to my left, we've got Ryan Schrader, a Client Service and Business Development Officer for Mondrian. And online, we've got Zolt Mester, a Senior Portfolio Manager, and Sam Wyatt, another Senior Portfolio Manager. They're going to walk us through the performance report, Mondrian update, and give us a little bit of education on China. So I'll turn it over to Ryan.
Great. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, trustees, staff, and MSARA members. As was mentioned, Ryan Schrader, Client Service Officer with Mondrian. Just a bit more background on Joel as a Senior Portfolio Manager on our International Equities team. He works directly on the strategy in which MSARA is invested. And Sam Wyatt, as well as being a Senior Portfolio Manager on our Emerging Markets team, and is one of the individuals at the firm who is solely dedicated to covering the Chinese market. Mondrian has been managing international equity assets for MSARA for over 12 years now. It's a relationship that we value greatly. I just wanted to take the opportunity to just give you a quick business update and acquaint you with us as a firm. We are based in London. All of our investment staff are in the same office, and that's where all of our investment research takes place. We have about $50 billion in assets under management dedicated to equity and fixed income strategies, and the international equity team manages $30 billion of that total. Mondrian has enjoyed a very stable and consistent leadership during our history. Senior members have been working together for a very, very long time with very little turnover, and we're quite proud to be 100% employee-owned. And that equity partnership is widely spread throughout the business without half our staff being partners in the business today. I'll just turn your attention to quickly page 8. In the center box, you can see our international equity team itself. This is led by Liz Desmond as CIO, and the decision-making body for your portfolio is Mondrian's International Equity Strategy Committee. The bolded names that you see in that chart are the senior members that have been working together on average for 15 years. It's a very diverse group with a mix of different backgrounds and industry experiences. Those are all of my prepared remarks on the organization, so happy to turn it over to Jolt to cover our investment philosophy and the portfolio review.
Great. Thank you very much, Ryan. Good morning, everybody. I'll start off with a quick refresher of our philosophy, then I'll pause for a moment to see if there are any questions. And if not, I'll cover performance, outlook, and positioning before handing over to Sam to cover China. So starting off on page 14, as you know, Mondrian is a defensive, value-oriented manager. And really fundamental to our investment philosophy is the belief that the value of an asset is equal to the present value of the future cash flows associated with that asset. And of course, in the case of publicly listed equities, this mainly comes in the form of dividends. And accordingly, we use a dividend discount methodology consistently across all of our equity products to value stocks, sectors, and markets. And in our view, this focus on dividends really allows for comparability of companies across different accounting standards, as dividends are less easily manipulated compared to earnings. When we look at the dividend streams that we derive, we inflation adjust all of those future dividend streams to ensure that we're looking at the real inflation adjusted returns on offer. And we then discount those future dividend streams using a 5% real discount rate. And this discount rate is used again consistently across all of our equity products, providing an apples for apples basis of comparability. So we do not flex the discount rate in our models. Instead, the way we capture risk is by performing detailed scenario analysis, also looking at the best and worst case outcomes for any potential investment. And what we're trying to do is forecast a plausible range of outcomes for a stock to understand how wide the range is and what the skew within that range looks like, rather than just to invest on the basis of a point estimate. And this scenario analysis is really crucial from a defensiveness and downside protection perspective, which, as I've mentioned, is really integral to our philosophy, as our focus particularly on that worst case scenario helps us steer clear of some of the most risky names with significant potential downside. Our investment research is very much fundamental in nature, and so we put a lot of emphasis on meeting with management teams, often on their premises. And because we have reasonable scale and take meaningful positions in the stocks that we do own on behalf of our clients, we usually have very good levels of corporate access often up to the CEO, CFO level. And finally, as investors based in the US, you're naturally focused on US dollar denominated returns, and we use a long-term purchasing power parity approach to currency analysis as derived by our fixed income team. And we implement that both from the top down in terms of hedging decisions, as well as from the bottom up when we look at the currency exposures of individual securities. And overall, with our investment approach, we seek to provide 3 key characteristics to our clients. Firstly, meaningfully higher real inflation-adjusted returns over time. Secondly, we structure client portfolios in a way that they preserve capital when equity markets experience protracted declines. And this defensiveness is derived both from the focus on dividends, which are generally less volatile than earnings, as well as our methodology of using scenario analysis, and in particular, as I mentioned, the importance that we attach to that worst case analysis. And finally, we also provide portfolio performance that is less volatile than benchmark indices and in general, other investment managers. And the next page really is a proof statement of our investment philosophy, showing those defensive characteristics in practice over the long term. And this is also representative of what we hope to achieve going forward for our clients. In terms of what the page is showing, on the left-hand side, you can see that in bull quarters, when markets have risen, we have captured most, but not quite all of the upside. In the middle of the page, you can see that when markets have fallen, we have outperformed the index, preserving capital. And then finally, on the right-hand side, you can see the compounding effect of that downside protection, which has been meaningful over time. And as a result, we have produced a return ahead of the benchmark and well ahead of inflation over the long term. So I thought I'd pause here for a moment to see if there are any questions on investment philosophy. And if not, I can jump on to cover performance, outlook, and positioning.
Trustee Jurdy, go ahead.
Yeah, so I have some questions on this. And first of all, I think this is an area that I would like us as a board to spend a lot of time looking at. When we look at each of our mutual funds, that we look at what's their strategy and maybe get a little more explanation about how you're trying to apply your strategy, so to not just show us what happened in the past, but why you think it will likely succeed in the future. So I appreciate that this chart shows that this fund has better hedging protection against the downturn in the market and also outperformed its benchmark. I do have a question after you explain maybe what you're. So maybe I'll just leave it at that right now. What's the question? My question is, can you explain what exactly your strategy is that you think will be successful in the future in replicating this, where it has better protection against the downturn and beating the upside of the market?
Sure. I think there are a couple of reasons why we think the strategy should continue to provide the characteristics that you see on this page. Firstly, we're very much long-term in nature, and so we can look through short-term turbulences in the market and really look at the underlying cash flow generating ability of the company, which is, as I mentioned, at the end of the day, really determines what level of dividends and capital returns the company can afford. And that long-term orientation really allows us to focus on that cash flow generating capacity and determine what levels of dividends we are expected to receive from the company over the long term. And then the second point I would highlight again is the scenario analysis that we undertake. This is something that we take very seriously. It's not a mechanical exercise by which we say reduce earnings growth rates by 1% or 2%. Instead, having done the bottom-up due diligence, the analyst will have a very good understanding as to what the key sensitivities of the model and the business are, and he or she will flex those assumptions, thinking about real-life scenarios to determine what we think the intrinsic value is also in the best and the worst case. And we focus on companies generally where the range is quite narrow and also where the skew is positive, in that the worst case scenario is hopefully quite close to the base case, i.e. the downside is reasonably limited. And then we have hopefully a good upside in a best case scenario. And so overall, that long-term orientation, focusing on the underlying cash flows, and also the scenario analysis, really focusing on the worst case, I think are two of the key factors that underpin the defensiveness that you've seen historically in the return patterns on this page.
So just briefly, do you have anything that's more specific than that? So I've seen where there are some funds that will do a screen for the companies that they select, for companies, for example, that have growth in profits and growth in dividends. Not that they're the highest dividend paying companies, but that it's sort of a screen for profitability. That's just one example. There could be other screens applied. But could you just explain a little more detail? Because you're not also selecting, for example, a particular sector in the economy. You've got healthcare companies, you've got manufacturing companies. It's all over the map. So what exactly is your screen that you're using to select which companies to hold, which ones to sell, that kind of thing?
So generally, we like companies with two characteristics. One, a high level of sustainable free cash flow generation that underpins cash returns to shareholders. And then secondly, we like businesses with strong, often net cash balance sheets, and that's particularly something that we've seen in Japan, where actually stock selection has been very strong, given the focus on those companies with very healthy net cash balance sheets. But what I would highlight is that we look at all of that in conjunction with the valuation, i.e. the price we're paying for that security. So we wouldn't exclusively look at securities that fall into a certain bucket in terms of balance sheet or cash flow generation, but look at the valuation that basically we have to pay for that company to achieve the cash flows that we expect in the future.
Okay, and then my other question has to do with the same page, but then also just refer back to the board, page 16 of Siegel's report. They showed what Callan's long-term returns, and I don't know if it's 10 years, 30 years, for these different investment sectors minus inflation, and Siegel's expectations, which are pretty closely aligned. So global exclusive of U.S. equities, Callan 6.95, Siegel 7.05, but that's exclusive of inflation, which they had put at a 2.5% figure. And then on this page, page 15 of your report, you're showing the 25-year performance of this fund was 6.2. Is that minus inflation, or is that the total return?
That is total return, and you see for the index, the same number is 4.9%.
So you're saying that the benchmark that we're comparing ourselves, which is MCI AC World exclusive of US, actually performed 4.9.
Correct.
This fund performed 6.2 over the last 25 years, looking backwards in the rearview mirror. But looking forward, Siegel and Callan are expecting this genre of funds, U.S. exclusive U.S. Equities, to earn roughly 7%. So is there something about the next 10 years, next 20 years, that makes you think that you're going to earn 6.2 or 7, or what's your expectations going forward? Do you think you're going to earn what Siegel and Callan are saying that we think we should expect over the next 10 years?
Sure. So over the very long term, and that is how we derived our real discount rate, what we found is that markets in general tend to return about 5% real over a long time horizon. Now, if we add, say, 2.5% inflation, and we can discuss what the right number is, that gets you roughly to 7% nominal return, which would be, I think, in line with the Siegel report that you referred to, even though I haven't seen those numbers. And we would expect in those circumstances to outperform the index, and generally over a full market cycle to outperform the index by about a couple of 100 basis points annualized. So if we were to see overall, 7% real over a full cycle, we'd expect to beat that benchmark by that couple of 100 basis points, obviously depending on market circumstances and so on.
Yeah, just to be clear, you're probably not looking at this, but the previous agenda item we had was looking at forward returns, and it was minus after the 2.5% inflation. They were looking at roughly 7% returns after inflation going forward. And so I'm just trying to understand what your expectations are for returns. If you're including inflation, are you still saying, look in the rearview mirror, 25 years, it was 6.2. what do you think it's going to be over, say, the next 10 years?
Generally, we would expect markets over the very long term to be about, in developed markets, certainly about 5% real, so 7% nominal is generally what we've seen over the very, very long term.
Okay, just trying to understand for the board, how do we align this? If our investment advisors are saying, well, we think we can achieve 5% after inflation, or 7%, including inflation, and then we have other advisors saying, well, your plan is dependent upon earning in this category 7% after inflation. The two aren't aligning, and so I'm trying to understand how this all balances out.
You can proceed. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. So in terms of performance, I start on page 18, which shows the 12-month performance as well as all the rolling periods. And over the past 12 months, the ACBX US index was down circa 5%, with the portfolio down less than 2%, providing, again, those typical defensive characteristics that are integral to Mondrian's philosophy. When we look at the -5 for the index over the 12 months, what we see is really a very stark contrast between the first two and the second two quarters of that period. In the first two quarters, the index was down circa 22% due to the geopolitical turmoils we've seen with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which of course translated into an economic shock in terms of an inflationary spike driven by commodity prices. Geopolitical shocks were exacerbated by a challenging economic outlook. With inflation rising rapidly, central bank intervention has been more aggressive at a time when growth in most economies was still fragile. And overall, that has created a pretty challenging environment with respect to the economic outlook. And so with the debt pileup driven by the COVID-19 measures by government to prop up the economy, coupled with that more aggressive monetary policy, has created overall quite an uncertain environment for markets as well. And then in the second two quarters, markets were up about 20%, wiping out some of the losses in the earlier quarters. And this was driven by three factors mainly. Firstly, we've seen a significant easing of the energy crisis in Europe. Gas prices, for example, are down 40% year to date to the end of March, and in effect back to pre-Russia-Ukraine levels. This has been helped by unusually low weather-related demand, leading to storage levels that are at, well above the historical average levels. And the expectation now is that Europe can muddle through the next winter as well until new sources of supply come on stream in the shape of renewables, floating gas storage, as well as more pipeline capacity from elsewhere. Secondly, economic data over the last quarter or two has generally been resilient, both in terms of composite PMI, as well as unemployment rates, which are at historic lows, for example, in the Eurozone. And overall, the impression is that strong labor markets and fundamentally quite healthy private sector balances, coupled also with fading supply shocks, are offsetting the drag from monetary tightening. And so economies are continuing to hum along, with GDP actually growing in most key geographies. The third key driver was that central banks have mostly been signaling that they're getting closer to a pause. There have still been rate hikes during the first quarter of this year, but also more and more talk around the risks to the inflation outlook becoming more balanced. And in terms of the portfolio's relative performance, as mentioned earlier, it was a strong 12 months on a relative basis, with the portfolio outperforming the index by about 350 basis points, again, providing defensiveness and capital preservation in a challenging market environment. Pages 26 to 28 provide a bit more granularity in terms of regional and sectoral return patterns. And in the interest of time, I don't want to dwell on this for too long, so just a few quick remarks. Firstly, on page 26, you can see that peripheral European markets, such as Spain and Italy, were amongst the best performers. Here, the respective indices benefited from their high weights to banks, which were strong on the back of the rate hikes, driving net interest margin expansion. But they also proved to be actually relatively defensive in a bank's context in March of this year, given that the Silicon Valley Bank and the Credit Suisse saga didn't pose the same questions around business models and liquidity, as they are more diversified, have little to no investment banking exposure, and are endowed mainly with sticky retail funding. The overweight position to these peripheral markets added to portfolio returns during the 12-month period, so that has been a positive for returns overall during the last 12 months. With respect to emerging markets, on the next page, you can see that the EM index overall lagged its developed counterpart, mainly or partly due to IT-related weakness in Asia, as well as a reversal of some of the strong prior performance in South Africa and the Middle Eastern markets. And then with respect to sectoral returns on the next page, really just two quick points to make. Firstly, consumer-related sectors have outperformed, as the outlook has generally improved, albeit from a low level since the beginning of this 12-month period, particularly with the easing of the energy crisis taking significant pressure off household budgets in Europe. And then on the weaker side, you can see the real estate sector being the outlier. And the sector has been particularly weak following the Silicon Valley Bank and Credit Suisse saga. One of the second order effects of the banking sector issues is that conditions in terms of lending are set to tighten, and that is going to be felt most severely by companies with high leverage and large refinancing requirements, which explains why the real estate sector has been weak overall during this 12-month period. This takes us to the attribution page on the next slide, slicing and dicing relative return into its different components. As mentioned earlier, the portfolio provided good downside protection, outperforming the index by about 350 basis points, coming mostly from country allocation and stock selection. In terms of country allocation, the overweight position in peripheral European markets, such as Italy and Spain, was a significant driver, along with the overweight to the UK. And in terms of stock selection, both Japan and the UK contributed positively. In Japan, the key positive has been Takeda, the pharma company, where the business continued to deliver strong organic growth, led by its flagship drug called Entyvio, which is used to treat inflammatory bowel disease. And what we've seen during the last 12 months is that the economic life of this drug has been extended due to the lack of biosimilar development, and that has been very helpful for returns from that stock, both in absolute and in relative terms. In the UK, the standout performers have been BP, the oil major, driven by the strong cash flow generation on the back of high oil and gas prices, as well as Imperial Brands, the tobacco company, where execution continues to be very solid with aggregate market share gains across Imperial's top 5 markets, and with particularly strong numbers in the US due to a combination of a business turnaround project and down trading. And this is a clear improvement driven by the new management team after many years of operational weakness under the previous leadership. And given the strong operational performance, the company has announced a multi-year buyback program, with the first installment being a £1 billion share buyback to be implemented in 2023. And so overall, we've seen good relative returns from the portfolio, really providing the defensiveness and the downside protection that we would generally expect from a Mondrian portfolio with focus on downside protection and defensiveness. With respect to outlook and positioning, I would turn you first to page 33, where you can see the breakdown of the portfolio and the developed piece of the portfolio in particular. And here really just 2 points to make. One is related to the overweight position in a developed context to Asia Pacific. And that comes from the very significant weight, both in absolute and in relative terms to Japan. And there, what we've continued to see is that the third area of Abenomics, which is focused on corporate governance and companies utilizing their balance sheets in a more efficient manner, continuing to gain traction, even though sadly Abe is of course no longer with us. And what we've seen there in terms of the portfolio's exposure is that we've added to the portfolio at several names with very different sectoral and end market exposures, but the commonality across them is that they all have very strong, often net cash balance sheets. And we believe these are the companies that can really benefit from those trends in terms of more efficiently utilized balance sheets. And we also believe these are the companies that would provide a good level of defensiveness and downside protection in a more difficult market environment, because their strong balance sheets allow them to continue to invest in the business and at the same time remunerate shareholders. And the second point I would make is with respect to Europe and the Middle East, where the portfolio in the developed context again is underweight. And really what's more sort of stark in terms of the breakdown within Europe is that the UK is a material overweight. And the corollary of that, of course, is that continental Europe is a significant underweight. In the UK, the overweight goes all the way back to the Brexit referendum in 2016. In the immediate aftermath, we've seen a lot of the UK domestic names being very, very weak. And in that context, while we believed, and we still believe, that Brexit will and has already created significant challenges to the UK, we found a lot of domestic UK names to be very much undervalued, given this indiscriminate sell-off for domestic names that we've seen in the aftermath of the referendum. And overall, the other point that supports the overweight position both to the UK as well as to Japan is that both currencies look extremely undervalued on a purchasing power parity basis, according to our currency analysis. With respect to emerging markets, overall, the portfolio is broadly equal weight to the index. And you can see the emerging market breakdown on the next page, page 34. And the only point I would make, and that is, of course, the elephant in the room, is that the portfolio has a meaningful overweight position to China. And I will let, of course, Sam talk in more detail about what we see in China and why we find the market overall attractive. And so overall, just to summarize and conclude, on page 43, what you can see is some of the static metrics for the portfolio. And those that are particularly important to us are price to cash flow and dividend yield, as managers focused on cash returns to shareholders. You can see that the portfolio trades at a significant discount on a price to cash flow basis and provides a meaningful uptick in terms of a dividend yield. Overall, we continue to find very attractive value across our investment universe. We believe the portfolio looks very cheap, not only in a base case scenario, but we also believe that it would continue to exhibit those typical Mondrian defensive characteristics should we see a more turbulent economic and market environment. So I'll stop here and pause for a moment and see if you have any questions on performance, outlook, and positioning before handing over to Sam to cover China.
Could you just tell us what the ticker number is for this mutual fund?
So just to clarify, the investment that MSARA has is in a limited partnership, so there's no actual direct ticker for this particular strategy.
So you do have other mutual funds with tickers. Is there another fund that you have that's publicly traded that is essentially the same fund?
We do, not the exact same fund, we do have an international equity. It's benchmarked against the MSCI EFI index as our mutual fund, which would be the developed market portion of this portfolio, as well as our emerging market fund with a separate ticker that would represent basically the emerging piece of your All Countries of World ex-US portfolio. So those two together broadly get you to the portfolio that you're seeing in your private fund here.
Okay, so I'm sorry, can you recap that? Is it the Mondrian Global Equity Value, or is it the...
The Mondrian International Value Equity Fund would be the first.
Okay.
And the Mondrian Emerging Market Value Fund would be the second one I mentioned.
And what's roughly the ratio of one and the other?
It's about 30% invested in emerging markets and the other 70% in developed.
Thanks.
Any other comments or questions from trustees before we move on? Seeing and hearing none. Sam? Floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Ryan, could you, brilliant. Thanks, Ryan. So good morning, everyone. I'm Sam Wire, Senior Portfolio Manager here at Mondrian Investment Partners, covering Chinese equities. If we slide to the next slide. Just in terms of today's presentation, I wanted to briefly outline what I wanted to cover, and that is I'm going to start by highlighting China's long-term performance, and then some of the short-term performance, and give some factors behind that short-term market weakness. Then I'm going to go on to some of the longer-term market strengths and maybe why it's particularly interesting from a US investor perspective right now. And then highlight some of the potential longer-term risks of investing in China and how we manage those risks here at Mondrian, very much aligned with what Joel was saying around risk analysis and range of outcomes, before finally making some concluding comments and then answering any of your questions from my side. So on to the next slide. And you'll see here, this is the long-term performance of the Chinese stock market. We have the total return profile of China over 20 years in gold, delivering around a 10% annualized return. That compares to MSCI Emerging Markets ex-China, with the grey dotted line delivering around a 9%, and the S&P 500 around an 8%. So generally, over the long term, I think it's fair to say China's delivered a pretty solid return profile. On to the next slide. And you'll see more on a short-term time horizon here over the past 2 years. We've seen a meaningful underperformance of MSCI China, again in gold, relative to emerging markets ex-China in blue. And you can see that underperformance by around 38%, also an underperformer versus the S&P 500. So just moving on to the next slide, I wanted to kind of talk through the factors explaining that 2-year underperformance. Firstly, it's important to put that underperformance into context, as China had been a meaningful outperformer up to 2021, driven by very solid earnings growth. So part of this relative underperformance may have been linked to mean reversion. However, there were a number of China-specific factors that weighed on market performance. The first one is regulation. The Chinese government put in a number of regulation in areas such as content, for example, in the protection of minors from things like gaming addiction. We've seen reforms focused on the redistribution of wealth, with the banning of excessively expensive after-school tuition operators, making education more accessible for lower-income groups, in areas like protecting delivery work drivers and controlling hours, offering health insurance coverage to these delivery drivers. We've also seen reforms in banning anti-competitive practices in the e-commerce space, local services space, and other monopolistic behavior in the fintech and consumer tech platforms. And finally, we've seen a branch of regulation around kind of data security, both at an individual and state level. I think if any one of these regulations had come at kind of a normalized pace, the market would have digested that. But the kind of unpredictable and concentrated nature of multiple simultaneous regulations, I think, negatively impacted investor sentiment. Thankfully, that kind of phase of regulation has passed through, and there's some very clear indicators from the government in the way of rectification plans and fines being paid and so on, that phase of regulation is over. And I think it's also important to highlight, whilst these regulations did cause short-term market dislocation, we do think they are consistent with China's longer-term, high-quality growth focus. The second factor has been real estate. China historically has had an outsized dependence on their local real estate market, and this has led to speculative pricing and elevated levels of inventory in certain regions. As China seek to slow the real estate market by applying restrictions to consumer and developer financing, this has weighed on certain sectors as well as consumer sentiment. Having seen a substantial correction in new starts in China to a more normalized level aligned with demand, the regulators eased a lot of the financing restrictions towards the end of 2022, and we're seeing a more stabilized level of activity in that real estate sector now. Third, from a domestic perspective, has been China's zero COVID policy. Having initially contained the pandemic relatively well, China was not able to develop their own mRNA vaccine for nearly 2 years. And this meant whilst the rest of the world was opening up following a pretty robust vaccination program, China remained heavily locked down. And this substantially weighed on GDP growth, particularly for offline activities. And again, in that from a consumer sentiment perspective. China also sought to ease these zero COVID policies following the People's Congress in October of last year, which whilst was disappointingly late, I think it did demonstrate Xi's pragmatism in wanting to get back on track with his economic growth objective of doubling GDP by 2035, and early kind of data showing that recovery is looking quite promising. And then finally, in terms of, this final factor from a global perspective has been the ratcheting up of geopolitical tension between the United States and China. There have been numerous events from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, followed by Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, which have raised concerns around a non-peaceful reunification of Taiwan and China, to restrictions around advanced semiconductors and more protectionist policies such as the Inflation Reduction Act, as well as the threat of delisting the Chinese ADRs for not allowing access to their audit papers. This has definitely weighed on global investor appetite and kind of willingness to invest in China. Just moving to the next slide. We think it's really important as a balanced fundamental value investor to also, take into consideration the longer term strengths of a market like China. So I've highlighted these strengths here. Firstly, China's got a highly skilled and educated workforce. They produce something like 3 times the number of science, technology, engineering, and math graduates compared to the US. They're targeting to increase their R&D spending to around 2.5% of GDP. And they've taken, the global pole position in terms of IP patent filing. And we believe, this fundamental backdrop will support innovation and productivity growth. China also has a strong track record of policy implementation. They've delivered consistent leading GDP growth within an emerging market context and have had a long-term foresight to develop leading positions in areas like green energy, things like electric vehicles, batteries, renewable energy. China leads meaningfully in all of those areas, we believe. There remains meaningful room for consumption growth and premiumization. China's consumption to GDP is only around 40% versus the United States, which is closer to 70%. And as China rebalances its growth model away from fixed asset infrastructure towards domestic consumption, we believe there will be significant opportunities. Productivity growth is further supported by advanced levels of infrastructure. For example, we see some of the highest levels of 5G penetration globally in China, similarly in terms of high-speed rail network. From a monetary policy perspective, China's maintained an orthodox approach. This has meant, by and large, it maintains a stable currency versus the US dollar and has low levels of inflation with CPI around 1%. This means whilst the rest of the world is kind of like going through a difficult monetary cycle, within China, there's very much scope for further easing. As a US investor, we believe the Chinese market is especially interesting at the moment, not only because of its underperformance, but also given it has the lowest correlation with developed markets relative to the other emerging markets. And it has the broadest opportunity set with an investable universe larger than the rest of emerging markets combined. And what I mean by this is, in emerging markets, there are examples like Taiwan and South Korea that are very, very strong, but they are dominated by the IT sector. In China, there's breadth across sector. And this is really important when we're going to talk about the risks shortly, because ultimately we're looking for maybe 15 to 20 ideas in an investable universe of 3,000 Chinese companies. And finally, we believe, the Chinese market is particularly prone to bouts of excessive optimism and pessimism, lending to alpha generation for a long-term fundamental focused value manager like ourselves at Mondrian. Moving on to the next slide, and I just wanted to talk through these longer term risks of investing in China. As I touched on earlier, we think geopolitics is front and center. There's clearly been an increase in geopolitical tension. There's bipartisan opposition, we believe, against some of Chinese activities. We don't see that easing in the medium term. Specifically, there's concerns around China's may seek a non-peaceful reunification with Taiwan. Ultimately, our view here is that we see a continued Cold War with a lot of tough rhetoric, but ultimately we think it's very unlikely to see any substantive action given China's very heavy dependence on the US dollar for global trade, as well as very high levels of energy and food imports. Not to mention the fact that I think China will be watching, the actions of Russia in Ukraine and seeing that it's not so easy to conclude some of these conflicts in a week or two. From a geopolitical perspective, there are also other concerns of investment restrictions or supply chain restrictions in areas like advanced semiconductors or other areas of national security such as defense. But we tend to side more with maybe Bill Gates's view that some of these restrictions may actually act in a counterproductive manner and may encourage the acceleration of China to develop their own advanced semiconductor capacity. There are also risks around a broader decoupling in trade between the West and China and a reshoring of manufacturing away from China to other hubs of industrial activity, places like Mexico and Southeast Asia. However, more than 120 countries globally count China as one of their as their largest trade partner. So we think this decoupling may be slower and less impactful than many fear. Outside of geopolitics, demographics have been deteriorating for some time, recently being surpassed by India as the most populous country worldwide. This will weigh on economic growth if not managed effectively. As a consequence of China's fixed asset investment growth model, China's got high levels of debt, somewhere in the region of 300% of debt to GDP. This means they'll no longer be able to rely on this growth model, will need to transition to a domestic consumption and a higher value added growth model driven by productivity and innovation. And there will be risks in this transition. As I touched on earlier, Chinese households still retain heavy dependence on real estate assets, and China will need to carefully manage the adjustment out of real estate assets into other investment tools such as their domestic equity market and bond market, whilst maintaining consumer sentiment. Finally, any meaningful regulation or government interference that kind of interferes and impacts on that innovation, entrepreneurism, or effective capital allocation is also a risk factor. So given this backdrop in terms of risk profile, how do we, just on the next slide, how do we manage these risks at Mondrian? As Joel kind of explained, downside protection is a really fundamental focus within our investment methodology. So it's something we think a lot about, and it's a really important contributor to ultimately our alpha generation. So from a geopolitical perspective, we manage our absolute exposure to China and Taiwan. We seek to avoid areas that might be subject to investment restrictions or disruption from investment restrictions, specifically areas like Chinese semiconductor companies. We also seek, as far as possible, to invest in domestically driven companies, or where we look for multinational exposure, we look for it in low-risk areas with global, established supply chains, or in low-risk areas, something like home appliances. With regard to the demographic risk, we look to structure portfolios to avoid heavy labor-intensive areas that might be subject to future wage cost inflation. And we also look to, as this is a potential opportunity, and you'll see, we have overweights in areas like healthcare and life insurance, which should be direct beneficiaries of the aging population. We avoid areas of heavy dependence on unsustainable business models, such as we believe, the real estate developers in China, as well as Joel mentioned, areas of high leverage, which we see in the industrial space in China. And finally, from a policy perspective, we seek as far as possible with a valuation discipline, but we want to invest with government policy. And some of the examples might be in areas like domestic consumption or in areas such as renewables. So just to conclude, moving to the next slide. We believe China remains one of the world's largest and fastest growing economies with significant scope for value add through stock selection. China has significantly underperformed over the last 2 years and remains deeply discounted. We have clear reasons to explain this underperformance as discussed and believe we're cognizant of the risk profile. However, we still firmly believe through our deep research experience and our disciplined fundamental process, China offers a really attractive risk-adjusted return. We're overweight the market, having trimmed some of our exposure on relative recent performance. And if I may, I'll just kind of demonstrate that approach with the next 2 slides. So here we just have a graph depicting China's relative performance versus MSCI EM ex-China. And you'll see in and around the end of 2022, we were at pretty extreme levels, or we viewed them as pretty extreme levels of relative underperformance versus its history. At that point, we were relatively, 6 to 7% overweight versus the EM bucket in the way that we view it. And we saw a really attractive range of outcomes for our Chinese exposure. That skew that Joel was talking about, we viewed it as exceptionally attractive as at that point and justifying that significant overweight position. Subsequent to that, we saw this easing of real estate. We saw the easing of zero COVID policies, and there was a 50% rally between November and the end of January. With that rally, we've reduced that overweight in a disciplined fashion because, we made a significant investment return. The range of outcomes had deteriorated with that growth, and we took profit. And then finally, on the last slide, is just from a relative valuation perspective and where we stand right now. So right now, China, from a PE perspective, is trading around 14.5 times. We see, or the market sees, a substantial unwind in forward earnings with the macroeconomic recovery with reopening to around 11.5 times, which would be, nearly 2 standard deviations below its 5-year PE average. This compares to the S&P 500, which is trading, over 20 times, with a more marginal unwind in forward earnings if it can avoid recession this year. So just finally, as a team focusing on emerging markets, we see enormous value opportunity in China at the moment, with our stock selection showing very, very attractive risk-adjusted returns and hence our pretty significant overweight positioning there. So I'll just hand over to you for any questions.
Yeah, Ryan, I have a question regarding your conclusions where you talked about being overweight and trimmed our exposure following that recent outperformance. Looking at the previous presentation, we were at 39.1%, I think, under that exposure. Is that after you've trimmed, or is that the result before changing?
Yeah, that's after we made, some of the more material trims in and around the end of January. So we did have a very significant overweight to the market, and that was given what we believed was those basically extreme levels of valuation. But where we, the presentation was the holdings as at the end of the first quarter.
Yeah, it says March. So what was our percentage prior to that? Do you know?
It would have been around, 10% higher, not in absolute, but in terms of our emerging exposure. So we would have been, I think we're roughly around 10-ish percent in your absolute portfolio. That would have been 11, 12 on absolute level at the peak level.
So it would have been close to 50, somewhere in that area. Yeah. Okay. That was my only question regarding the educational material when compared to the previous presentation. Any other trustees? Trustee Harris?
Okay. And I'm sorry, to whom am I speaking? Is this Ryan? Okay.
I'm Sam.
Okay. Ryan, I had the opportunity a few years back to attend the Global Pension Forum on Emerging Markets that was held in Beijing, Hong Kong, and Vietnam. And one of the things that I noticed of the numerous situations that presented themselves or that was part of the research is the whole area of climate change and in particular the smog in Beijing and the fact that even at that point where China was emerging as a global power, certainly they've succeeded in getting there to date, was the fact that every family got a piece of coal to put in their stoves, and it was difficult to see even 2 buildings away. And as we concentrate more and more in the U.S. and in the West on how to protect our environment and improve the situation with climate change, what, from your perspective, has happened that has moved China along further in their economic stimulation of cleaning up their environment? And just a little personal piece to add to this, when CalPERS, CalSTRS, our CFOs, CEO, and board chairs were entertained to such an amazing degree then, they even closed the wall of China and we had a sit-down dinner on the wall. And they said that was the first time they had done that. What about the economic situation now that these 2 superpowers are no longer trying to and how is that impacting our investing?
Thank you for your questions, and it's great to hear that you've been out to China. Firstly, on the climate change question, and it's something that, having covered the market in China, that I've kind of seen myself as well. I'm regularly in China. I've seen a marked improvement in air quality, and I think it's something that's very, very important to Xi Jinping himself. He's got this very, very clear green agenda, and I think this is multifarious in that, behind semiconductors, oil is one of their #1 imports. So from a security perspective, something that China spoke a lot about at their very recent People's Congress towards the end of last year, independence in terms of their energy policy is really important to them. And because of that, we've seen them invest very, very heavily in something like solar panels. So China produces something like 95% of all global solar panels. They're very, very competitive at it, and they're driving very meaningful increases of investment in solar. They're doing very similar things in wind. They're a little bit behind in wind, but you're seeing very aggressive levels of investment there. And then from a transportation perspective, we've also seen them invest very heavily in areas like battery technology, where they've got the global leading company CATL, as well as the global leading electric vehicle company, which is BYD, a stock kind of invested by Warren Buffett. So whilst China remains kind of, as you touched on, pretty heavily dependent on coal, and that remains the case today, they are exceptionally focused on achieving those green ambitions. And we've seen meaningful upticks in, the power generation from renewable. And we've got a number of investments in that space that we think have got a very attractive growth profile, but also, at these levels of evaluation, offer, very attractive risk-adjusted returns. From a geopolitical perspective, moving on to your second question, it's quite kind of interesting, kind of marrying it up with the green agenda, in that it will be interesting to see, because China's so dominant in these areas like renewable and green energy, how the world will be able to achieve these kind of conflicting areas. Will there be some consensus in areas like green energy, such that the world moves to a greater good, or will there be areas that they can't agree on? In terms of how we think about it, we see kind of the division between the US and China as a relatively structural element. We build it into, all of our investment thesis, and is probably number one kind of on the risk agenda when we're analyzing Chinese kind of investments. So from that perspective, we're really looking, and this is why I was talking about the breadth of the asset class, we're really looking for domestic investments that are very low down in terms of the risk profile. And one example that I'd give is something like home appliances. We've got a leading home appliances kind of air conditioning company, has got exceptional kind of market leadership in terms of backward integration of their costs, as well as kind of leading global positions in terms of their distribution and cost. And we think, this is a relatively low risk area. We don't think that it's kind of an area that could potentially come under restrictions. We don't see the US putting huge limitations around kind of the production and premiumization of home appliances. So it's very much around being very thoughtful in the stocks that we pick and how we position this portfolio, both to shield ourselves from the risk of geopolitics and to be able to potentially benefit from some of the opportunities from this domestic consumption runway and, in areas like you touched upon in green energy.
Thank you. Great answer.
Any other trustees, comments, conversations, questions? Thank you all. We appreciate your time for being here remotely and in person. And we'll move on to the next item under section 3, which would be Callan. I see Claire and Hannah are here.
Thank you very much, all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. He hit every one of them.
Claire and Hannah, we appreciate your patience with us today. We're running behind schedule, but is there a presentation you would like Judy to bring up to talk about?
Absolutely, and I think Robert's working on it.
Okay.
Yeah, I could
So-
run the presentation, Judy, since I'm in there.
While Robert's pulling that up, certainly recognize that you have an important agenda today, and we do want to be mindful of your time. The one key agenda item that we have for today is just a performance review. So there are no proposals or decisions to be made. It is a performance update through the first quarter of 2023. Next quarter, looking forward, what are we working on between now and then is a domestic equity structure study. So as you all know, there's been significant discussion around the asset allocation and implementation of that asset allocation for this investment program. And the next step in that process is to look more deeply at the structure of the domestic equity portfolio. So that's what's coming. As far as performance that we will be reviewing today, fortunately, it's good news. So Hannah and I were speaking yesterday as we prepared for this meeting today, and noted that, emotionally, it's hard to know if the markets have been up or down in the year-to-date period, and what about the fiscal year-to-date period? Well, glad to report that markets are actually up, and the performance for your plan looks quite good through March and through April. We've included the monthly update. So with that, I will pause and turn it to Hannah to give a brief update of the capital markets through March, just as context for the performance that we'll see for the MSARA investment program. Touch that. You're good.
Can you hear me? Okay, sorry. Okay, so overall equity and fixed income markets were up together in the fourth quarter and the first quarter. Returns were positive for both equities and fixed income. As Claire mentioned, there was significant intra-quarter volatility. Strong returns in January were followed by negative returns in February and mixed results in March. If you look at the chart here, you'll notice that all returns are positive for the quarter, with the exception of private equity and real estate, which are lagged. The S&P 500 was up 7.5% again. It was also up 7.5% at the end of 2022. Global ex-US equity markets also posted strong results, and fixed income was positive, up 3% again. A major thing that we noticed this quarter and last quarter is that we saw a significant reduction in losses. So looking at the first 3 quarters of 2022, we were down about 24%, and the rebound in the last 2 quarters alone has reduced that loss to just under 10%. Inflation, notably, has continued to tick downwards year over year, under 5%, significantly lower than when it was peaked in June and around 9%. And with that, I'll move on to slide 6 to take a deeper look at U.S. equity markets. Could you go to slide 6, please? Or slide 9, sorry. I think my pages are different. So as Claire mentioned, this provides some context for when we look at your manager's performance. The S&P, like I mentioned, was up 7.5%, and notably 3 sectors comprise over just under 50% of the S&P 500. So that's your technology, communication services, and consumer discretionary. Those 3 sectors also make up almost 2/3 of the Russell 1000 growth, really drove performance for the quarter. You can see on the right, Russell 1000 growth led all styles and market caps, up 14% for the quarter. The only style and market cap to produce negative returns was a small cap value, which was down about 70 basis points due to financials and the turmoil in the banking sector. Large caps outperformed small caps, and we saw a reversal in the trends from 2022, with growth outpacing value as speculation around interest rates continued. Moving to the next slide, we'll take a look at global ex-US. So again, we saw solid results here, despite banking hiccups over the first quarter. Similar to domestic markets, we saw growth outpace value. Within regions, Europe was a strong outperformer. Europe ex-UK was up 12%. And in undeveloped markets, we saw China up 11%. Strong returns there, mostly due to their reversal of the zero COVID policy at the end of the year. And then looking at fixed income on the next slide, the Bloomberg Ag was up 3%, following one of its worst year ever in 2022. We've seen a rebound as Feds continue to raise interest rates to over 5%, helping to ease inflationary pressures. And with that, unless there are any capital market questions, we can take a look at performance.
All right, so starting on page 13, this page always captures total plan growth for the MSARA portfolio over time. And of course, notably, the long-term trend has been up and to the right, and that's continued. You can see the volatility that we've experienced in the market and how that's translated to market shifts, or market value shifts rather, in your portfolio on the far right of that chart. But most notably in the last 2 quarters, you can see how the strength of the capital markets in the last 2 quarters have benefited the total MSARA plan, and much of that is what you'll see in the return when we look at fiscal year to date returns, notably being positive thus far. The bottom half of this page captures market value changes over that fiscal year to date period through March. So you can see in total in the investment return column, the program has seen $32.6 million in investment gains fiscal year to date, and that's translated to a return of about 5% fiscal year to date, and we'll see that in a couple slides. The other notable thing on this page is that net new investment column shows a fair amount of money moving around, and what that captures is a number of different rebalances that Robert executed during the fiscal year to date period. So that includes a rebalance that was executed around October, funding of the IFM, one of your infrastructure managers, at the end of December, early January, so some rebalancing activity at that time. And then there was a start to rebalancing activity in February, which was paused, waiting for further discussion of the target asset allocation. And once that was concluded, notably kind of subsequent to the end of this March report, rebalancing was conducted again by Robert to bring the total asset allocation of the plan back in line with that strategic target. And we'll look at that again in a minute. On page 14, we look at a snapshot of the actual asset allocation of the plan versus the strategic target as of the end of the quarter again. So this is kind of a point in time, but there's a couple notable differences between the actual asset allocation and the target allocation. So the first is that the real estate and infrastructure allocations were slightly overweight to target as of the end of the quarter. That was really due to movement in the remainder of the portfolio. So as we saw negative returns out of the public equity and fixed income portions of the portfolio in 2022, that meant that real estate and infrastructure became bigger slices of that total pie. Importantly, those overweights are still within range when we look at the appropriate ranges within the investment policy statement. So that's being monitored. Robert's effectively rebalancing around those at this time. But notably, the other thing that you'll see on this page is that the domestic equity allocation was underweight to target as of the end of the quarter and did trigger a rebalance. So as I mentioned before, that was executed subsequent to the end of this quarter, and the total portfolio should be back in line with that target at this time. So did want to point those out. Robert, if you'll flip ahead to page 17, I always like to note the additional detail in this report of changes in market values among each individual asset category and each individual asset manager within the plan. Looking at the very bottom row, we see how all of that has aggregated up over the course of just the quarter since the end of December. And you can see a net positive gain in investment return in aggregate of $27.7 million. So that's increasing the total market value of the plan by that amount from investment gains during the quarter. You also see a positive net new investment and a fair amount of money moving around during the quarter. Again, that's kind of a point-in-time slice of a partial implementation of the rebalance. When we look at the bigger picture, including next quarter, that will be kind of the full capture of the rebalancing activity that was undertaken during the quarter. At the end of March, the total plan stood at $646.7 million. And then page 18 looks at total plan performance ended March 31st, 2023. So I mentioned that it was a positive quarter despite the intra-quarter volatility that we experienced. And the plan ended up 4.47%. That's ahead of the target return by a handful of basis points, which was up 4.43% just for the quarter. And that performance landed in the 35th percentile of a peer group of other public funds. Over the last year, we do see a negative return still, reflecting the returns that were experienced in 2022, but only down about 4.5%. That notably was also ahead of the total fund benchmark, so the plan in implementation protecting value versus the strategic target by about 80, 90 basis points. That performance landed in the 38th percentile of the peer group. Over longer time periods, the plan has done very well versus the strategic target as well as versus other public plans. For the most part, ranking in the top quartile of that peer group and outpacing the strategic target over longer annualized periods. Page 19 looks at a different slice of the same information, just looking at fiscal years. Most notably on the far left, you see the fiscal year-to-date period, which I alluded to before. The total fund is up 5.3% fiscal year-to-date through March versus 4.98% for the strategic target. We do capture the negative fiscal year return from 2022, but over this page and the following page, we look at 10 separate fiscal years, and there are only 2 on the page that are negative. So again, that building up into those longer-term annualized positive returns that we saw on the previous page. One other thing that stands out to me on this page is, historically we've talked a lot about that this plan versus the peer group has landed kind of in the top or the bottom of that, top quartile or the bottom quartile of that peer group. And in the last few years, the board has taken actions to try to minimize some of that volatility, implementing infrastructure, taking some of the small cap overweight within domestic equity out of the implementation of the portfolio, so reducing that a few years ago. And if you look at just the last 2 fiscal years, it is a short time period, we certainly recognize that, but thus far I think it has been effective in reducing that volatility. The last page I'll hit is page 23. Again, just in the interest of time, we always capture total fund attribution, so what led to those positive relative returns over the last quarter and over the last year. The last quarter is captured in the top half of the page, the last 1 year on the bottom half of the page. And notably, to me, what stands out is that the manager effect was positive in both those time periods. So the implementation of the asset categories that you've selected, those managers in aggregate have driven the outperformance of the plan. For the last 1 year in particular, in aggregate, the managers really protected value on the downside for their portfolio, leading to a less negative return over that 1 year time period. Real estate is the only negative manager return that you see over those 2 time periods from a manager effect perspective. And notably, we still continue to monitor your real estate managers. We don't have any new concerns there, but ultimately the 2 of them together underperform the Odyssey benchmark over that time period. Every other asset category in the last year has contributed from a manager effect perspective. Now, to conclude, on pages 24 and 25, we always include all of the detail, how each individual asset category and asset manager has performed over both near-term and long-term time periods. I'm glad to field any questions on any individual manager or asset category performance, but do want to be mindful of the time and the remaining agenda.
Not seeing any questions.
Okay.
Is there any public comment regarding any of the items under 3 for investment matters?
There is no public comment.
I think that covers everything for item number 3. We appreciate your patience in being here in person and the good news.
Sure. Yeah, glad to be here. Thank you all.
Thank you. That takes us to item number 4, discussion regarding environmental, social, and governance belief statement. Executive Director Rentschler.
Thank you, Chair Cromer. In the board memo in your packet, it discusses our past education and board direction regarding whether or not to craft an ESG. We provided several educational opportunities regarding ESG investing. Callan and staff have no strong impetus to require an ESG or recommend an ESG statement of belief in the investment policy, but it was a specific board action outlined in the strategic plan for the board to decide whether or not they want to pursue one. If so, based on board direction, we'll bring back suggested language either next month or in July when we present the investment policy update. Is that correct, Robert? Okay. Did you have any questions regarding anything in the memo?
Any questions from board members? Any direction or guidance? Go ahead, Trustee Harris.
Okay, where is it again? Down here. Helpful, particularly in the economic climate that we have now, that we have, what are we looking for, a statement or with being part of our strategic plan that we consider developing a position on ESG.
Any other trustee comments regarding ESG in the memo presented?
If the board chooses to pursue adding an ESG belief statement, we have some draft language. It's relatively generic. It doesn't create a mandate. It just indicates that we would not prohibit a manager from considering certain ESG expectations when they value companies that they may choose to hold. But obviously, our board's fiduciary duty is to select the best investment with the best risk return offset for the plan. And there would be no mandate related to ESG provisions.
Well, as you've described it, I don't see any downside because some funds are using ESG screen as part of their screen, others aren't. I think, probably all of us are looking at slightly different things, but that's not my first priority, but it's not something I would want to exclude a fund because they have an ESG screen.
And I think specifically how it applies to our strategic plan, we've put that in motion, so we should see something in writing. I know our June meeting is getting rapidly busier as we talk, and it's going to get even busier here in a minute. But
our plan just says the board needs to look at it and consider whether or not they want to do it. It's not that the plan said you would adopt a statement. It said the board needs to discuss whether or not to include that in your investment beliefs. And like I said, we'll be bringing that back within the next month or two along with the policy.
okay. Is there any other direction to staff regarding this item? Any public comment regarding item number 4?
And
ESG.
to confirm my understanding, to bring back the policy statement with a ESG belief statement.
That's my understanding. Yes.
Okay.
Ms. Zeller, is there any public comment?
There is no public comment.
Thank you. And regarding item number 5, Searle Article 8.4, I'll be pulling that from the agenda. There is no timeliness that's necessary regarding that item at this time, and the Board of Supervisors, it's my understanding, will be considering that item next week on Tuesday, so it's still on time for us, and I do appreciate all the hard work you put into it, but we'll be pulling that item for today.
It would have come back in July for actual adoption. This was an opportunity for the board to provide any input on the policy. You're also welcome to email me any comments, questions, or suggestions you have.
Thank you. Item number 6, discussion and possible action regarding the fiscal year 2022-23 budget. Financial Investment Officer, Mr. Reveles.
Yes, Board, before you, you've got the budget update memo as well as a budget amendment memo. I went into a fair amount of detail on both of them, and so I'm prepared to answer any questions or concerns you might have. Any thoughts?
Any trustee conversation or comments regarding the proposed budget?
Excuse me, Chair.
Yes.
I believe we need a motion for the 2022-23 budget amendment.
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead. You want to address the amendment?
Sure. The amendment is primarily related to the restructure on REEF and the outperformance by JP Morgan. So that's the two real issues there. In terms of REEF, I tried to make this point in the memo. We've always paid fees to REEF in one way or another. Before the restructure, those fees were paid out of net assets. So we weren't actually changing our interest through the number of units that we had in the fund. But now that we have this restructure, there are transactions taking place within our account that we have to recognize in order to reconcile the balances. So that is the major change. And that's about half of the total expense. My estimate in the 2024 budget is about 45 basis points. So that's what we're expecting to play out over this final quarter of this fiscal year. Any questions on that, on REEF?
We will need to entertain a motion regarding the budget amendment as presented for fiscal year 2023.
The JP Morgan item is very similar. Again, we're selling units of the fund to pay for investment and incentive fees. The investment fees, investment management fees have gone down a little bit over time. The incentive fee has gone up as a result of the sustained outperformance above the 7% hurdle. They're something like 9.5%, up north of 9.5% year to date through April. So we are incurring additional fees through sales of units in the funds. We're not actually writing a check.
Understood. So we have a motion to accept, to approve the budget amendment as presented. Is there a second? Thank you. We have a motion and a second.
I have a question on the on the incentive fees. Did the terms change since we signed the contract, or they always had that term that if they outperformed by a certain amount, that the incentive fee would go up?
Yes.
We don't pay an incentive fee if they don't meet the hurdle. Then once they go over the hurdle, we pay the incentive fee. The more they outperform the hurdle, the more the performance incentive fee is.
And there could be a case where they don't sustain that performance. So if maybe they don't sustain that performance over the next 6 months, that incentive fee will go down. So in this amendment, I'm assuming performance will continue where it's at today.
But the basis points of the percentage of the performance fee, that hasn't changed. It only goes up because the value of the asset has gone up. Their performance increased, so when they apply the basis points for the incentive fee to the higher dollar value, that's why the cost has gone up.
The cost has gone up in part for both reasons. The net asset value investment in the fund's gone up, as well as sustained higher performance.
But the basis points specified in the contract do not change. There hasn't
That's
been a
correct.
hurdle there. That's what I'm trying to say.
That's correct.
The basis points percentage fee that we pay didn't alter. We're paying more on a dollar value because of the increased value in assets and their outperformance.
Yes, that's correct.
So just to be clear, so in years in which they outperform, they get an incentive pay. What happens in years where they underperform? Do we get a rebate?
No, no, we don't.
So how do we figure this out for averaging? I mean, maybe it's more stable than the stock market, I assume, but so they outperform a couple years, they underperform 5 more years. I mean, how do we average this out?
Well, there's no clawback provisions. So we pay for their management, and that's it. We don't get anything back. Now, I will say we're only paying about 185 basis points in total, which is less than 200 basis points on a typical private equity fund, not even including the additional hurdle 20% rate. So when you compare those types of structures, this is slightly lower than what we would expect from something like private equity.
Thank you. We have a motion and a second. Any further trustee conversation regarding those items? Any public comment?
There is no public comment.
Ms. Zeller, will you take a roll call vote, please?
Ms. Cubison?
Aye.
Ms. Cavanis?
Aye.
Mr. Jurdy?
Yes?
Mr. Cromer?
Aye.
Mr. Shoemaker? Ms. Harris? Approved.
Thank you. That takes us to item number 7, discussion and possible action regarding the proposed fiscal year 2023-2024 budget. Executive Director Rentschler.
Thank you, Chair Cromer. Trustees had an opportunity to preview the proposed budget a couple of weeks ago. I appreciate those that provided comments and questions. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them now. Robert provided a very thorough introductory memo, and we're looking for a motion to approve the proposed budget for fiscal year 24.
Do we have any conversation or questions regarding the proposed budget?
One comment, and that kind of goes back to the last one, 25%. We're at 75% of budget in the same period as the year before. But our budget, this new budget does go up, so we believe that we'll make up the 25%. The current budget's down, and when I say down, not expended, and then add some. Did that make sense?
I'm not sure what you're
Are you
exactly
referring to a
asking.
specific line item or the administrative budget as a total or investment?
Well, as a total at the bottom of, oh God, where was that? Well, in the previous one, as you went down the whole budget, most areas were off. Expenses were lower than expected significantly. Okay, boom, let's make that statement clear. The next one is the new budget has an increase, so you believe that you will make that 25% back up and add some more next year in expenses.
Hold on, I'm reviewing the projected actual, because obviously we don't have full numbers for this fiscal year. So Robert went ahead and projected our expected 22-23 actuals to come in at. I'm looking at the
Schedule 2.
on page 8 of the handout. And we are expecting an overall increase that has to do with several different areas of increased expenses that we expect to see, including managers' fees, some personnel cost, and things like consulting, actuary, and LRS for programming, because we've had more activity in those areas than has been experienced typically in the past.
Okay.
Any other questions or comments regarding the proposed budget? Is there any public comment regarding item number 7?
There is no public comment.
I would entertain a motion.
I'll move approval of the proposed budget for 2024.
We have a motion. Is there a second?
We gotta serve coffee next time.
We have a motion and a second. Thank you, Trustee Harris and Vice Chair Shoemaker. Ms. Harris, Ms. Zeller, if you'll do a roll call vote.
Ms. Cubison?
Yes.
Ms. Cavanis?
Aye.
Mr. Jurdy?
Yes.
Mr. Cromer?
Aye.
Mr. Shoemaker?
Aye.
Ms. Harris?
Aye.
Approved.
Thank you. That takes us to item number 8, discussion regarding the Historical Benefit Review Project and status report project updates. Executive Director Rentschler.
Status report was provided for the board's review. We're making, I'm sorry, this was not the most updated version. I did provide a newer one that I'll provide next month. It'll just give you the summary of the cases that were completed as far as the activity for the month, but you can see we completed 5 last month and additional 7 notices went out with corrections that'll be effective in June. We're just trying to work on this as staff can to put us in a better position for when we do hear from the IRS. So if there's any questions on this, I'm happy to address any questions. It's a receive and file. It does not require a motion.
Any questions, comments, or concerns, feedback? Is there any public comment regarding item number 8?
There is no public comment.
Thank you. We'll file that as received. We appreciate the update. Takes us to item number 9, discussion and possible action regarding approval of out-of-state travel. Executive Director Rentschler.
Thank you, Chair Cromer. This item the board has heard about before. As it turns out, our policy requires that any out-of-state travel that was not specifically budgeted for be individually approved by the board. So this item is just being brought back for a motion for approval to regarding my attendance at the Fraud Prevention Conference from the International Foundation of Employee Benefit Plans in State Line, Nevada in July. I had already discussed it with the chair prior to the registration and have the approval of the CEO for out-of-state travel, but I had not presented it for an actual board action item.
Move to approve.
We have a motion.
Second.
We have a second. Any trustee conversation or discussion regarding this item? Any public comment regarding item number 9?
There is no public comment.
Thank you. Ms. Zeller, will you do a roll call vote?
Ms. Cubison?
Yes.
Excuse me. Ms. Cavanis?
Aye.
Mr. Jurdy?
Yes.
Mr. Cromer?
Aye.
Mr. Shoemaker? Ms. Harris? Approved.
Thank you. That takes us to item number 10, Discussion regarding the administrative report, Executive Director Rentschler.
Thank you, Chair Cromer. The update on our election for the seat vacated by Trustee what was
Hawkins.
his name?
Hawkins.
Yes, I'm sorry. Trustee Hawkins, we received one declaration of candidate. This is being presented to the Board of Supervisors for them to cast one unanimous vote in favor of Alex, and he should be available to be sworn in at the next meeting. There is also an update on pension gold updates being released within the next couple of months, an update on our upcoming seminars with a date provided of August 10th for a special PEPRA planning seminar and a pre-retirement seminar in September. We're working on some building updates, including estimate for roofing work, and the Stackers legislative update is provided for your reference. There are no action items with this report. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer any questions.
I do appreciate the thoroughness of your report and did see future trustee Land in attendance, so I appreciated that earlier during our meeting. Is there any other questions or conversation regarding the administrative report? We'll consider that filed and move on to item number 11. That would be general board member discussion. Trustee Harris.
It was exceptionally well done and well received by everyone with whom I spoke. I know most of us can't really afford, from jobs or whatever, time to go down and be in San Diego on a beautiful days. But the sessions were well thought out with people that added considerably to knowledge that I have, and so I'm grateful to Sarah for that educational opportunity. I also saw Andy there as well, and many people that I have gotten to know through my state service. I want to say, though, that I was a little chagrined to come back and find that the vote that we had taken at the prior meeting, as far as removing a little bit of risk from our portfolio and having an opportunity to get some fixed income that addressed our rate of return. And I do acknowledge that there is an ability to take and return something for discussion that was previously voted, but it was voted on by our full 9-member board. I was unable to attend last month because of a little accident I had while planting a plant, and I won't go into it, but when I woke up in the morning, both eyes were, I needed to see a doctor, and I had to drive to Santa Rosa to do it, or I never would have missed the meeting. I know that Catherine was also ill and was unable to be there. I don't know about Board Member Covison. But the message, I've always looked at this board as being extremely congenial. We work together. If something is decided, it's decided by all of us, not decided by all of us and then undone the next month by 5. And certainly gender wouldn't enter into that. So as a professional, I certainly accept what was decided as a person who thought that there were people on this board who were friends. A heads up would have helped. It wasn't until I read the agenda. As a matter of fact, as I was driving down to Santa Rosa to try to catch this one doctor's appointment at 9:30 in the morning that I would be able to get, because the next opening was the following Monday, and I probably would have had to go to an ER. I still am a little disturbed at what happened. So I am expressing that. And I hope I don't see it again.
Thank you. Trustee Anderson.
Just a quick note that Trustee Smith and I both attended a virtual Calipers Roundtable, I guess, a week ago Friday. And it was, timeliness could have been a little better because it was it was on asset allocation. And it was very informative. There was at least one of the speakers was from the CAIA, and just an excellent training opportunity. For those of you who haven't participated in one of those virtual roundtables, it's convenient and it's a great educational opportunity.
Thank you. The only general discussion I have for the board is that I will not be present at next month's meeting, and Vice Chair Shoemaker will be running the meeting for me. I will be taking a vacation and out of state, so I won't be able to attend. Any other general board member discussion? I think that takes us to item number 12, which is closed session regarding employee performance evaluation for our executive director. You could please let me know when we're not recording and in closed session. Thank you.
The board met in closed session to discuss preliminary discussions on the executive director's performance evaluation, and the chair appointed 3 trustees to serve as labor negotiators, trustees Jurdy, Shoemaker, and Cubison.
I believe the last one was Smith.
And Smith, thank you.
Not Cubison, Smith.
Sorry. Yes, thank you.
So you have that? Ms. Zeller, did you get it?
Yes, I did. Thank you.
Thank you. So that takes us towards notice of our next meeting, which would be June 21st, 2023 at 8:30 in the Board of Supervisors chambers, and we are adjourned.
I'd like to recall for the audit committee members, we have an audit committee meeting immediately following this one. So at the request of Mr. Anderson, we will have a very, very short break. Audit committee meeting starting here momentarily.
Thank you.
Good job.
Thanks.